What happened to me in 1989 near Rome, Georgia, changed everything I thought I knew about our world. I was part of GBRI, Georgia Bigfoot Research and Investigation at the time, and while I'd always believed these creatures existed, nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered. It was early October, the air was getting crisp, and the leaves were just starting to turn. I'd been on 2 previous expeditions with GBRI, but this one was different. We had special permission from the Georgia Forest Service to investigate an area they'd closed off to the public due to reported unusual activity. Looking back, I think they knew more than they were letting on. The day started around 5:30 a.m. I remember checking my watch as I loaded up my gear, my trusty maglite, a basic 35mm camera, plaster casting materials, just in case, water, and some trail mix. I'd been doing this long enough to pack light, but smart. The temperature was around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was this light fog hanging between the trees that made everything feel somewhat surreal. The research area was about 2 hours from any significant population, deep in a section of forest that didn't see much human traffic. We had a small team, just 3 of us that day. The Forest Service had given us coordinates to focus on, and we'd planned to spend the entire day there. Around 8:30 a.m., something felt different. I've spent countless hours in the woods, hunting and hiking since I was a kid, but this was new. The forest had this heaviness to it. You know how sometimes you can feel someone watching you? It was like that, but amplified. The birds had gone quiet, not all at once like in the movies, but gradually, until you suddenly realized everything was just still. I wear a size 14 boot, and I've always been proud of my outdoorsman skills, especially tracking. That's why what I found next hit me so hard. I was checking a game trail when I noticed an impression in some damp soil. At first, I thought maybe it was where someone had dropped something heavy, but as I cleared away some leaves, my heart nearly stopped. It was a footprint, clear as day, but it was wider than my boot by at least half an inch on each side. Measuring it carefully, it came to about 13.5 inches in length. The stride length between prints was what really got to me. I'm 6'2", and when I tried to match the stride, I had to stretch uncomfortably. Whatever made these was big, really big. The prints showed clear toe impressions, 5 of them, with subtle dermal ridges visible in the clearer prints. This wasn't some hoax with wooden stamps. The pressure points and weight distribution were consistent with something living. While I was documenting the prints, the first smell hit me. Everyone talks about the smell, but nothing prepares you for it. It wasn't just your typical forest rot or animal musk. This was different. The best way I can describe it is like wet dog mixed with something fermented, but even that doesn't quite capture it. It was strong enough to make my eyes water, and it seemed to come in waves with the light breeze. Then the wood knocks started. At first they were distant, could have been anything, but they had a pattern, 2 quick knocks, pause, then a single knock. This repeated 3 times over about 15 minutes. We tried to triangulate the source, but the sound seemed to move. It was messing with us, or testing us. I'm still not sure which. Around 1 p.m., everything escalated. The temperature had climbed to about 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and I was taking a water break when I heard branches snapping. Not small twigs, but the kind of breaks you hear when something very large moves through dense forest. It was maybe 100 yards away, just beyond a thick stand of pines. The breaks formed a line of movement, heading parallel to our position. That's when I saw it. Through a gap in the trees, something massive moved. It was only visible for maybe 2 seconds, but time seemed to slow down. The figure was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair that looked almost reddish where the sun hit it. Its movement was what struck me most. Fluid, deliberate, nothing like a bear or any other animal I'd ever seen. The head sat directly on broad shoulders, no visible neck. The arms were long, hanging well past where a human's would end. My camera was in my pack. By the time I got it out, the figure was gone. But the movement through the forest continued. The smell intensified, and then we heard it, a vocalization that I still have trouble describing. It started as a low rumble, almost subsonic. You could feel it in your chest more than hear it. Then it rose into something between a howl and a scream, but with this guttural quality that no human or known animal could produce. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, and I swear you could hear it echoing off the mountains. We spent the next few hours casting the prints and documenting everything we could. The Forest Service took our report very seriously, more seriously than you'd expect for a mythical creature sighting. They had us sign some papers, took copies of our photos and cast. I kept one cast for myself, though I'm not supposed to admit that. What haunts me most isn't the sight of the creature, or even that bone-shaking sound it made. It's the intelligence I felt that day. Whatever we encountered wasn't just some animal. It was aware of us, it was studying us, and it was smart enough to stay just out of clear sight while letting us know it was there. The way it moved around us, the pattern of the wood knocks, the strategic placement of where it chose to become visible, all of it spoke of something with a level of intelligence that still makes me uncomfortable to think about. I've been back to those woods many times since then, but I've never experienced anything quite like that day. The Forest Service eventually reopened the area, and if you go there now, you'd never know anything unusual had happened. But something did happen. I know what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled. The cast sits in my office drawer, and sometimes I take it out just to remind myself that it was real. The experience changed me. When you encounter something that shouldn't exist according to everything you've been taught, it forces you to question what else might be out there. I'm more careful now when I'm in the woods, more observant, and sometimes, when I'm deep in the forest and everything goes quiet, I get that familiar feeling of being watched, and I wonder if it's the same creature, still out there, still studying us. I've heard other stories since then, from all over Georgia and the surrounding states. Many match details of what I experienced. The wood knocks, the smell, the size of the prints. Too many to be coincidence, too consistent to be mass hysteria. Something's out there in our forests, something that's managed to stay just out of reach of definitive proof, but real enough to those of us who've encountered it. To this day, I can't walk in the woods without scanning the trees, looking for movement, listening for those distinct wood knocks. The rational part of my mind tries to explain it away, but then I remember the cast in my drawer, the photos, which frustratingly didn't show much, just a dark blur through the trees, and that feeling of being in the presence of something ancient and intelligent. I'm sharing this now because I think it's important for people to know these encounters happen to regular people, hunters, researchers, outdoorsmen who know the woods and know the difference between normal forest sounds and something truly unexplainable. I'm not looking to convince anyone or prove anything. I just know what I experienced that day in 1989, and it was real. Whatever's out there, it's not a myth, it's not a legend, and it's definitely not just a guy in a suit. It's something else entirely, something that makes me realize how little we truly know about the world around us. Story 2. What happened to me back in '92 near Somerville, Georgia, changed how I look at our forests forever. I still get goosebumps thinking about it, and sometimes I wake up in cold sweats remembering that afternoon at Tidings Creek. It was June 15th, 1992. I remember the date clearly because it was my day off, and I'd been planning this solo camping trip for weeks. I needed to clear my head after a rough patch at work, and the woods had always been my go-to place for that. The weather was perfect, sunny, around 75 degrees, with a light breeze that kept the bugs away. I'd set up my camp about 2 miles into the woods off Tidings Creek Road, nothing fancy, just my old Coleman tent and basic gear. Around 3 p.m., I decided to take a walk to explore the area. I'd been hearing some weird noises all morning, nothing too alarming, just different from the usual forest sounds. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to how quiet the birds had gotten. The woods were unusually still, but you know how it is when you're trying to convince yourself everything's normal. I had my water bottle, compass and hunting knife, force of habit from years of camping, wearing my favorite red flannel shirt and sturdy hiking boots. The sun was filtering through the canopy, creating these patches of light on the forest floor. That's when everything changed. About 200 yards from my campsite, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. At first I thought it was a black bear cub, which got my heart racing because where there's a cub, there's usually a mama bear nearby. But when I turned to look, I froze. Standing there, partially hidden behind a thick oak tree, was something I still struggle to explain. It was roughly 5 feet tall, Definitely not full-grown whatever it was, with jet black hair that had this weird sheen to it in the sunlight. Not fur like a bear's, this was different, more like human hair but coarser. The build was all wrong for a bear too, thin, bipedal with proportions that were disturbingly human-like but not quite right. Its eyes, God, its eyes were dark but intelligent, watching me with what I can only describe as calculated curiosity. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but something else happened instead. The creature took a step to its left, then another, maintaining eye contact the whole time. Before I knew what I was doing, I started following it. I know how stupid that sounds. Trust me, I've replayed this moment in my head thousands of times, wondering what the hell I was thinking. The way it moved was mesmerizing. It would walk about 30 feet, stop, look back at me, then continue, never running, never hiding completely. It weaved through the trees with this fluid grace that made my clumsy human movements feel embarrassingly awkward. The creature would duck under branches that I had to push aside, step over fallen logs that I had to climb over. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I was sweating despite the mild temperature, and my mouth had gone completely dry. The weirdest part, I didn't feel threatened. Terrified, yes, but not in danger. It was like being pulled along by some sort of primal curiosity that overrode my common sense. After what must have been about 15 minutes of this strange game of follow the leader, though honestly time felt weird at that point, I started noticing something that made my blood run cold. There were sounds coming from both sides of me, subtle but distinct, cracking twigs, the soft shuffle of feet through leaves, branches moving against each other in a way that wasn't caused by wind. That's when reality hit me like a bucket of ice water. I stopped dead in my tracks, my legs shaking. I could feel them. Two larger presences, one on each side of me, maybe 40 feet away in the thicker brush. They were coordinating with the younger one, moving in perfect sync to keep me going in a specific direction. The smell hit me then. This powerful, musky odor that reminded me of wet dog mixed with something else I can't quite describe. Sort of like rotting leaves and something metallic. My throat tightened up, and I started feeling lightheaded. Fight or flight was kicking in hard, but I knew running would be suicide. In what was probably the most surreal moment of my life, I spoke out loud, my voice shaking. I'm heading back to my camp now. I have no idea why I said it, or if they could even understand, but it felt like the right thing to do. The young one stopped and tilted its head slightly, in an almost human gesture of acknowledgement. Then, something even stranger happened. As I turned around and started walking back towards my campsite, trying desperately to keep my pace steady despite wanting to sprint, I could sense them escorting me. One on each side, staying just out of clear sight, but definitely there. The juvenile one had disappeared completely. The walk back was the longest of my life. I could hear them moving parallel to me, matching my pace exactly. They kept this up until I was about 75 yards from my campsite. I know because I could see the red of my tent through the trees. Then, as suddenly as it had all started, the forest came alive again. Birds started chirping, squirrels resumed their chatter, and that oppressive feeling of being watched just lifted. I waited until morning to pack up and leave. Didn't sleep a wink that night. Just sat in my tent with my knife in my hand, listening to every sound in the darkness. The next day, I tried to find tracks or evidence, but the forest floor was too dry and covered with too many leaves to show anything conclusive. I've gone back to those woods a few times since then, during the day, with other people. Never saw anything like that again. But sometimes, when I'm out in nature, I'll catch that distinctive smell or hear a branch crack in just the right way, and my whole body goes rigid. I know they're out there, and I know what I saw. What keeps me up at night isn't the fear of what I encountered. It's the realization that they were intelligent enough to coordinate, to communicate, to escort me back. They weren't just animals acting on instinct. They were protecting their young one while satisfying its curiosity about me. They let me see them. Sometimes I wonder if they chose me for some reason, or if I just got lucky, or unlucky depending on how you look at it. I've never filed a report or gone public with this before. Who would believe me? But I know what I experienced that afternoon in Tidings Creek. Those weren't bears, weren't people in suits, weren't my imagination. They were something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist according to science but does. And they're smart, way smarter than we give them credit for. Story 3. I've been holding this story inside for over 25 years now. What happened that night in Taylor Ridge, Georgia, back in '97 changed everything I thought I knew about our world. I've read other people's encounters over the years, and each time I get this knot in my stomach because I know exactly what they went through. I know that feeling of having your entire reality turned upside down in just a few minutes. It was early October 1997. My wife Sarah and I had taken our 4-year-old son Tommy camping with her parents at this spot we locals called the Swamp, near Taylor Ridge. It wasn't really a swamp, more like a low-lying wooded area that got pretty wet after rains, but the nickname stuck. We'd been there dozens of times before. It was one of those perfect fall evenings in Georgia, temperature probably in the low 60s, just cool enough to need a light jacket. We had our campsite set up about 200 yards from the nearest access road, close enough to be safe, but far enough to feel like we were really out there. Sarah's dad, Bill, was an experienced outdoorsman who'd been hunting these woods since he was a kid. He knew every trail and hollow in Taylor Ridge like the back of his hand. That's why what happened that night shook him so badly. It was getting dark, probably around 7 p.m., and Bill suggested we take a walk to check out some deer trails he'd spotted earlier. Sarah stayed back at camp with Tommy and her mum, who were getting dinner ready. Bill grabbed his Coleman lantern, one of those old-school ones that run on white gas, and put out this really bright white light. I had my flashlight too, just in case. The woods were starting to come alive with night sounds, crickets, frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl. We'd walked maybe a quarter mile from camp, following this old logging road that was more like a wide trail now. Bill was showing me some fresh deer tracks when we both noticed something odd. The forest had gone completely silent, and I mean completely. 1 minute it was a normal, noisy Georgia night. The next it was like someone had hit a mute button. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Bill had stopped talking mid-sentence about the tracks. He'd been doing this his whole life, and I could tell by his body language something wasn't right. That's when we caught that smell, like a mix of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something else I can't even describe. It was strong enough to make my eyes water. I was about to suggest we head back to camp when we heard it. Heavy footsteps moving through the brush about 50 yards ahead of us. Not like a deer or a bear. These were deliberate bipedal steps, something walking on 2 legs. Bill raised his lantern higher, and that's when we saw it. Standing between 2 large oak trees was something that shouldn't exist. It was huge. I'm 6'2", and this thing towered over me by at least a foot or two, but it wasn't just the height that struck me, it was the mass. This thing was massive, with shoulders twice as wide as a big man's. The light from Bill's lantern caught its face first, and that image is burned into my memory forever. It had a face that reminded me of a gorilla, but different, more compressed, almost like it had been pushed in. The skin had this weird oily sheen to it, like it was wet or greasy. But it was the eyes that really got to me. When the light hit them, they reflected back this brilliant emerald green color, like a cat's eyes but bigger and more intense. The creature just stood there, doing this strange swaying motion, rocking back and forth slightly while it watched us. Its arms were incredibly long, hanging down past its knees. The whole body was covered in dark hair, not black, more like a really dark brown. In some places, especially around the shoulders, the hair looked matted and thick, almost like a mane. What strikes me most when I think back to that moment was how quiet it was. This massive creature, probably 700, 800 pounds at least, was moving without making any noise. No branches breaking, no leaves crunching. Just that heavy, deliberate footfall when it moved. Bill and I were frozen in place. I remember wanting to run, but being physically unable to move. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The creature just kept watching us, swaying slightly. It didn't seem aggressive. If anything, it seemed curious. But there was an intelligence in those eyes that was unmistakably aware. This wasn't just some animal. It knew exactly what it was doing. We must have stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. Then, without any warning or sudden movement, it just stepped back into the darker woods. No crashing through the brush, no running away. It just melted into the shadows like it was never there. The last thing I saw were those green eyes reflecting in the darkness, and then nothing. Bill and I didn't say a word. We just turned around and walked back to camp as fast as we could without running. When we got back, Sarah could tell something was wrong. Bill's hands were shaking so bad he could barely hold his coffee cup. We ended up telling them what happened, though we both knew how crazy it sounded. We didn't leave that night. Bill was adamant about not walking through those woods in the dark, but we packed up first thing in the morning. Before we left, Bill and I went back to the spot. We found some impressions in the soft ground that might have been footprints, but the ground was too hard in most places to show clear tracks. There was a broken branch about 8 feet up on one of the trees, freshly broken with the leaves still green. That was our last camping trip to Taylor Ridge. Bill sold his hunting lease the next year. He never said it was because of what we saw, but I knew. We've talked about it a few times over the years, usually late at night after a few beers. He's seen a lot in those woods over the years, bears, cougars, all sorts of wildlife. But he's never seen anything like what we saw that night. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what we encountered. I've looked at pictures of bears standing on their hind legs, studied every known animal that could possibly be in those woods. Nothing fits. Nothing explains what we saw. The size, the movement, those eyes. It wasn't anything known to science. The weirdest part? The next day, all the normal forest sounds were back. It was like nothing had ever happened. No strange smells, no silence, no feeling of being watched. Just a normal Georgia forest. If Bill hadn't been there with me, I might have convinced myself it was all a dream or hallucination. But I know what we saw, and I know there are things in this world we can't explain. I still think about those eyes sometimes, especially when I'm out in the woods. That intelligent, aware look. Whatever it was, it knew exactly what it was doing. It chose to let us see it. And sometimes I wonder if there are others out there, watching from the shadows, just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams. Story 4. It started as a typical early autumn morning. The air was crisp, around 52 degrees, with a light mist hanging between the trees. I'd arranged to meet my buddy Mike at our usual spot, an old logging trail about 2 miles up from the nearest access road. We'd been tracking a particularly promising patch of ginseng for the past few weeks, and the roots were finally ready for harvesting. I arrived at the meeting point around 6:45 a.m., just as the sun was starting to filter through the canopy. Mike was running late, which wasn't unusual for him. The forest was quiet that morning, too quiet, looking back. Usually, you'd hear squirrels rustling in the leaves or birds calling, but there was this strange stillness that I initially chalked up to the morning mist. I decided to start working my way up toward our spot, rather than wait around. The ginseng patch was about a quarter mile up a steep incline, in a shadowy area between two rock formations. As I made my way up, I kept hearing what sounded like heavy footsteps behind me, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. I figured it was just Mike trying to catch up. About halfway up the slope, I caught a whiff of something absolutely rank, like a mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something musky I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I've encountered plenty of dead animals in the woods, but this was different. This smell seemed fresh and mobile, if that makes any sense. That's when I heard it. A sound like someone dragging something heavy through the underbrush, followed by the snap of a thick branch. I turned around, expecting to see Mike, and called out, "Hey, you finally made it!" What I saw instead froze me in place. Standing about 30 yards downhill was something that had no business existing in the Georgia mountains. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, and covered in dark brown, almost black hair. But what really struck me was its face, so unnervingly human-like, yet definitely not human. Its eyes were deep-set under a prominent brow ridge, and they were fixed right on me with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. The creature was massive, with shoulders twice the width of any man I've ever seen. But what I noticed most was its strange gait. It was favoring its left leg heavily. When it shifted its weight, I could see it wasn't putting full pressure on that leg, causing its whole body to list slightly to the right with each step. I couldn't move. My whole body was trembling, but I was rooted to the spot. The creature and I just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then it made this sound, not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, something between the two that seemed to come from deep in its chest. The sound vibrated through my entire body. What happened next is burned into my memory. Instead of charging at me, which is what I was terrified would happen, it slowly turned sideways, never taking its eyes off me. That's when I got the clearest view of its injury. The left leg was definitely damaged somehow, causing a pronounced limp. It moved with a kind of rolling motion, compensating for the weak leg. As it started to move away, I noticed how it used the trees for support, reaching out with one massive hand to steady itself as it navigated the slope. Its fingers were huge, easily twice the length of mine, and the way it gripped the trees showed strength that would put any human to shame. The creature made its way up the opposite slope, and that's when I noticed something that still baffles me to this day. Despite its injury, it moved through the dense undergrowth with an almost practiced efficiency, like it knew exactly where to place each foot, even with its limp. It was clearly familiar with the terrain. Once it reached the top of the opposite ridge, it turned to look at me one final time. In that moment, I saw something in its eyes that I still can't explain. Not aggression or fear, but something almost contemplative. Then it disappeared over the ridge, the sound of its uneven gait gradually fading into the forest. I stood there for several more minutes, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The smell lingered, and the forest remained eerily quiet. When I finally got my wits about me, I noticed my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my ginseng digging tools. Mike showed up about 20 minutes later, complaining about car trouble. I tried to tell him what happened, but the words wouldn't come out right. How do you tell someone you just saw something that shouldn't exist? We ended up leaving without harvesting any ginseng that day. I couldn't bring myself to go any further up that slope. Over the next few weeks, I went back several times, always with Mike or other friends. We found footprints, huge ones, with one set always showing a different depth and pattern than the other, consistent with a limp. The left prints were always shallower, with a different pressure pattern than the right. The most compelling evidence came from the drag marks we'd find in the soft earth, long, continuous lines where something heavy was being pulled alongside normal footprints. Sometimes we'd find broken branches at about 7, 8 feet high, with hair snagged in the bark. I collected some, but never knew what to do with it. What's really stuck with me over the years is how this creature seemed to be surviving despite its disability. We'd occasionally find evidence of it digging for roots or overturning rocks, probably looking for grubs or other food. The tracks would show up in different parts of the mountain, but always with that distinctive dragging pattern. For years afterward, right up until 2012, I'd hear stories from other locals about strange sounds in those woods. Not just the usual wood knocks or howls people associate with Bigfoot, but the unique sound of something large dragging itself through the underbrush. The pattern was always the same, the dragging sound, followed by heavy, uneven footsteps. I've never gone public with this story before because, well, who'd believe it? But I know what I saw that day. That creature was real, and it managed to survive in those mountains for decades despite its injury. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, adapting and surviving in ways we can't understand. The most unsettling part? In all the years following that encounter, during all the times we found evidence of its presence, we never once found any sign of its death. No remains, no final resting place. It's like it just faded away into the forest, taking its mysteries with it. Even now, 38 years later, I sometimes lie awake at night, remembering those intelligent eyes and wondering about the story behind that limp. What could have injured something that powerful? And how did it survive all those years? I still go up to Dirt Cellar Mountain occasionally, though not for ginseng anymore. Every time I'm there, I find myself scanning the trees, listening for that distinctive dragging sound. The forest feels different now, knowing what's possible, knowing what secrets it might still be keeping. Some questions just don't have answers, I suppose, and maybe that's for the best. Story 5. I've been a long-haul trucker for over 30 years now, and what I experienced that rainy night in Marion, Arkansas back in '94 still haunts me. I've kept quiet about it mostly, but I need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone else has seen something similar in that area. It was October 12th, 1994, around 2:30 a.m. I was hauling industrial equipment from Memphis to Little Rock along Highway 77. The rain had been coming down hard for hours, one of those relentless southern downpours that make every trucker's life miserable. I'd been driving since early evening, and my eyes were getting heavy. About 15 miles outside of Marion, my truck started making this weird rattling noise from the front axle. Now, I've been driving trucks long enough to know you don't ignore strange sounds, especially not in the middle of nowhere during a rainstorm. I spotted a wide shoulder ahead and decided to pull over to check it out. Better safe than sorry, right? I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight, one of those big mag lights we all carried back then, and my rain jacket. The moment I stepped out of the cab, I was hit by that thick, humid Arkansas air. The rain had actually let up a bit, but everything was soaked. My boots immediately sank about an inch into the mud. As I walked around to the front of the truck, my headlights illuminating the area, something felt off. You know that feeling when the air just feels heavy, like there's a thunderstorm coming, but different. That's what it was like. The usual night sounds, crickets, frogs, all that, just stopped. Coming from a rural background, I know that when nature goes quiet, something's usually wrong. I checked the front axle but couldn't find anything obviously wrong. That's when I caught a whiff of something that made my stomach turn. It was this powerful, musky odor, like rotting meat mixed with wet dog, but worse, much worse. I've smelled dead animals before, but this was different, more pungent, more wild. I was about to head back to the cab when my flashlight beam caught something in the mud about 20 feet from my truck. At first I thought it was just a deep puddle, but something about it made me walk closer. That's when my blood ran cold. It was a footprint, a huge footprint. I'm not talking about some bear track or anything like that. I've hunted all my life, seen every kind of animal track there is in these parts. This was a footprint that looked human, but it was massive, easily 16 inches long. The impression was so deep in the mud, I knew whatever made it had to be incredibly heavy. With my heart pounding, I followed the tracks with my flashlight. There were 7 of them, clear as day, leading from the highway straight into the tree line. Each step was about 5 feet apart, way longer than any human stride. The depth of the impressions in the mud. I've hauled 800-pound machinery that didn't sink that deep. I had my disposable camera in my truck. I always kept one for insurance purposes in case of accidents. My hands were shaking as I took pictures of each footprint. I used my tape measure from my toolbox to get the size. 16 inches exactly, and about 7 inches wide at the ball of the foot. While I was measuring the last print, closest to the tree line, I heard it. A sound I've never heard before or since. It started as a low rumble, almost like a diesel engine idling, but then it turned into this deep, throat-like sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a breathing sound, but something in between. It came from the darkness beyond the tree line, maybe 50 yards away. Then I heard branches snapping, not small twigs, but the kind of sounds you hear when something big is moving through dense forest. The noise was getting closer, and that's when I saw movement in the trees. The rain had picked up again, making it hard to see clearly, but I swear I saw something massive move between 2 trees. It was dark, but in my flashlight beam I caught a glimpse of reddish-brown hair or fur. My flashlight caught 2 reflective eyes for just a split second. They were at least 7 or 8 feet off the ground. I've seen plenty of deer eyes reflect in my headlights over the years, but these were different. They were spaced further apart, and they seemed intelligent. That's the only way I can describe it. I didn't stick around to see more. I practically ran back to my truck, slipping in the mud twice. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I pulled away, I caught something in my side mirror, a large, dark figure stepping out from the tree line. The rain and darkness made it impossible to see clearly, but what I saw was enough. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and covered in hair. I drove straight to the Marion Police Department. The officer at the desk could tell I was rattled. I showed him the pictures I'd taken and told him everything. He actually took it seriously, said they'd had reports of missing cattle from farms in the area over the past few months. They sent a patrol car out to the site, but by then, the rain had washed away most of the tracks. I handed over my camera to them, and they said they'd develop the pictures and investigate. When I called a week later to follow up, they said the photos hadn't come out clear enough due to the rain and darkness. Convenient, right? Over the years I've done some research. Turns out that stretch of Highway 77 has a history of strange sightings. Local farmers have reported weird noises at night, missing livestock, and large unexplainable tracks. The area is pretty remote, with lots of dense forest and swampland. Perfect hiding places for whatever it was I saw. I still drive that route sometimes, but never at night if I can help it. Every time I pass that spot, my heart starts racing. I've never seen anything like that again, but I know what I saw. Those footprints were real. That sound was real. That figure in the darkness was real. The weird thing is, after that night, the rattling noise in my truck was gone. Mechanics couldn't find anything wrong with the front axle. Sometimes I wonder if that noise was just an excuse to get me to stop at that exact spot, at that exact time. Like something wanted me to see what I saw. I've kept this story to myself for years, partly because I didn't want people thinking I was crazy, and partly because I'm still trying to make sense of it myself. But I know what I saw that night wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal. Those eyes, they still haunt my dreams sometimes. To this day, whenever I'm driving through Arkansas at night and it starts to rain, I get this feeling in my gut, like something's watching, waiting. I don't stop on Highway 77 anymore, no matter what noises my truck makes. Some things are better left alone, and whatever's out there in those woods, well, maybe it's better not knowing for sure. Story 6. It was late June 2008, and I had taken my wife Sarah and our 2 kids, Emma 12 and Tyler 9, camping at a somewhat secluded spot about 15 minutes outside of Warrenton, Missouri. We'd found this peaceful clearing about 200 yards from the Missouri River, far enough from the main camping areas to feel like we had our own private spot, but not so remote that it felt dangerous. At least, that's what I thought at the time. The day had been perfect. We'd spent it fishing, hiking, and just enjoying being away from our phones and computers. The weather was warm, but not too humid, typical Missouri summer. As evening approached, storm clouds started rolling in, but we weren't too worried. We had a sturdy family tent, and the weather report had only called for light thunderstorms. We got the kids settled into their sleeping bags around 9:30 p.m. Sarah and I stayed up a bit longer, sitting at the picnic table under our canopy, talking quietly and watching the lightning in the distance. The storm was still several miles away, just occasional flashes and distant rumbles. Around 10:45 p.m., we decided to turn in. That's when things started feeling wrong. The first thing I noticed was how suddenly quiet everything got. 1 minute there were the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, frogs from the river, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, then nothing. Complete silence. I remember checking my watch, 11:17 p.m. Sarah noticed it too. She squeezed my hand in the darkness. We were both still awake, lying there in our sleeping bags, when we heard the first branch snap. It wasn't like the sound of a twig breaking under a raccoon's weight. This was loud, like someone had taken a baseball bat to a thick branch. Then the smell hit us. I've spent my whole life outdoors, hunting, fishing, camping. I know what bears smell like. I know what deer, skunks, and every other Missouri animal smells like. This was different. The closest I can describe it is like a mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something musky and acrid. It was so strong it made my eyes water. The kids were still asleep, thank God. Sarah and I lay there, barely breathing, as we heard heavy footsteps circling our campsite. Whatever it was big enough that we could feel slight vibrations in the ground with each step. Then came the lightning flash that changed everything. It was around 11:30 p.m. when a bright flash lit up our entire tent like it was daytime, and there, projected onto the tent wall like some twisted shadow puppet show, was a silhouette that turned my blood to ice. The figure had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It was massive, with broad shoulders and a distinctly ape-like head that seemed to sit directly on those shoulders. No neck that I could make out. The arms were impossibly long, hanging down past where knees would be on a human. Sarah started trembling beside me. I could feel her whole body shaking. I reached over and put my hand over her mouth, terrified she might make a sound. The thing was standing no more than 15 feet from our tent. For the next 2 hours, we endured what I can only describe as psychological torture. The creature never left. It would walk around our campsite, occasionally stopping near the tent. Sometimes it would go quiet for so long that we thought maybe it had left, only to suddenly hear a massive impact against a nearby tree that would shake the ground. The sound wasn't like someone punching a tree. It was more like someone taking a sledgehammer to it. The worst part was around 1 a.m. when it started making sounds, not growls or roars like you might expect, but these deep, chest-rumbling vocalizations that seemed to go right through you. They started as low humming sounds that would build into something between a moan and a howl. I've never heard anything like it before or since. The kids miraculously slept through most of it, though Emma did wake up once. I'll never forget the look of pure terror on her face when she heard those sounds. I just held her close and whispered that everything was okay, that it was just the storm, even as my own heart was about to burst from my chest. We didn't move, didn't talk, barely breathed. Just lay there in absolute terror as this thing patrolled our campsite. I had my hunting knife and bear spray within reach, but something told me they would have been useless against whatever was out there. The activity started to die down around 3 a.m., though none of us slept. We stayed completely still until the first light of dawn started to creep through the tent walls around 5:30 a.m. When we finally got up the courage to unzip the tent, the morning sun revealed a campsite that looked like it had been hit by a small tornado. Our picnic table was overturned. The cooler had been moved about 30 feet from where we'd left it, and it looked like something had tried to pry it open but couldn't figure out the latches. But the really unnerving evidence was on the trees. Several of the oaks around our campsite had deep gouges in them, some as high as 8 feet off the ground. They weren't like bear scratches. These were wider, more brutal, like something had deliberately torn into the bark with massive strength. Then there were the footprints. The ground was still soft from the rain, and they were everywhere. I measured them with my hand. Each print was easily 14 inches long and incredibly deep, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. They had 5 distinct toes and a mid-tarsal break that I later learned is characteristic of primate feet, not bears. We packed up in record time. No breakfast, no coffee, just throwing everything into the car as fast as we could. As we were leaving, I noticed something that still gives me chills. Leading away from our campsite toward the river was a clear trail of those massive footprints, and alongside them were several smaller prints of the same shape. Like whatever visited us that night hadn't been alone. I reported it to the local rangers, but they just took some notes and suggested it was probably some bears. But I know what bear signs look like. This wasn't that. The rangers did mention that there had been other unusual activity reports from that area over the years, but they wouldn't elaborate. We haven't been camping since then. The kids still don't like talking about that night, and Sarah has nightmares about it sometimes. I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters in Missouri, and while I found some that share elements with our experience, none quite match the intensity of what we went through. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't want to use the B word because I know how it sounds, but I know what we experienced was real, and it wasn't anything that's supposed to exist in Missouri's woods. Sometimes when I'm driving near wooded areas at night, I catch myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that massive silhouette again. And every time I smell something musky or hear an unusual sound in the woods, I'm right back in that tent, holding my breath, praying for sunrise. Story 7. I've been a wildlife photographer for over 15 years, specializing in capturing Colorado's diverse mountain wildlife. What happened in Pine Junction during the winter of 2012 still haunts me, and I've spent countless nights trying to make sense of it. I'm finally sharing this because I need others to know what's out there in our mountains. I had several trail cameras set up in a remote area about 20 miles west of Pine Junction at around 9,000 feet elevation. The spot was perfect, isolated, barely accessible during winter, and frequently visited by elk and mule deer. I'd been monitoring this particular location for months, mostly capturing typical mountain wildlife: deer, elk, the occasional black bear, and even a mountain lion once. On December 12, 2012, I drove up to check my cameras. The weather was brutal that day. Temperature around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, -9 degrees Celsius, with about 2 feet of snow on the ground. I remember the silence being almost oppressive. You know that weird quietness that comes with heavy snow? It was like that, but different somehow, more intense. I had 3 camera traps set up in a triangular pattern around a natural clearing where deer often fed. These weren't cheap cameras either. We're talking professional-grade equipment with night vision capabilities and motion sensors. I'd positioned them carefully to capture animals from multiple angles, especially around a fallen log where I'd noticed consistent deer activity. The first 2 cameras were fine, showing the usual deer and elk footage. But when I reached the 3rd camera, the one facing northeast toward the densest part of the forest, something felt off. Even before I checked it, I noticed the area around it felt wrong. The snow was disturbed in a way I'd never seen before, not like deer or elk tracks, which I can recognize instantly. These depressions in the snow were huge, easily 16, 17 inches long and spaced about 4, 5 feet apart. My hands were shaking as I retrieved the memory card. The camera itself looked slightly twisted on its mount, though still functional. Back in my truck, I never check footage on site, too cold, and the battery drain isn't worth it, I started reviewing the images. Everything was normal, until 2:43 a.m. on December 10th. That's when the sequence started. The first image showed something large moving at the edge of the frame. Initially, I thought it might be a bear, though bears should have been in hibernation by then. But the proportions were all wrong. This thing was standing upright, easily 8 feet tall, maybe taller. The second photo, taken 7 seconds later, still makes my stomach turn. The creature had moved closer to the deer feeder, and I could clearly see its outline. It was unmistakably bipedal, but nothing like a human. The shoulders were massive, probably twice the width of a large man's. The head seemed to sit directly on these shoulders, with hardly any visible neck. But what really got me was the way the arms hung. They were extraordinarily long, reaching almost to where knees would be on a human. The final photo came 8 seconds after that. The figure had turned slightly, and I could make out more details. The fur, yes, fur, not hair, not clothing, appeared thick and dark, with a slight silver sheen in the infrared lighting. The face was partially visible, but thankfully not clear enough to make out fine details. What I could see suggested a flattened nose area and deep-set eyes that reflected the infrared light. But here's what really shakes me. In this last photo, the creature appeared to be looking directly at the camera, not just in its general direction, directly at it, like it knew it was being photographed. When I returned 2 days later with a friend, no way I was going back alone, we found the camera had been damaged. The mount was bent, and there were scratches on the housing that looked deliberate, not random. The memory card was intact, thankfully, but the camera itself never worked properly again. I sent the photos to a friend who specializes in digital forensics. He ran every analysis he could think of and confirmed they hadn't been manipulated in any way. These were raw images, straight from the camera. The thing that really gets me, though, is what I discovered when I went back to photograph the tracks. They were mostly filled in with fresh snow, but I could still make out a clear pattern. Whatever made them had walked in an almost perfectly straight line, not the meandering path you'd expect from a bear or other wildlife. It moved with purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going. Since then, I've heard other strange stories from that area. Local hunters talking about feeling watched. Hikers reporting weird sounds at dusk, but nobody else has managed to capture anything on camera. I've tried setting up cameras in that spot several times since, but nothing unusual has ever shown up again. I still do wildlife photography, but I've moved my main operation about 20 miles south. I won't go near that original location anymore, especially not alone or at night. Something about the deliberate way it approached the camera, how it seemed to know exactly what it was looking at. It felt intelligent, aware. And that's what terrifies me most. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I captured that night. I've looked into every possible explanation. Bears with mange, moose standing oddly, people in suits playing pranks. None of them fit what I saw. The height, the proportions, the way it moved. It was something else entirely. The photos are secure now, stored in multiple locations. I've shown them to a few trusted colleagues and their reactions have all been the same. Stunned silence followed by a flood of questions I can't answer. I've considered releasing them publicly, but I know what would happen. They'd be dismissed as fake, picked apart by skeptics who weren't there, who didn't see the tracks, who haven't spent their entire careers studying wildlife. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I pull up those photos and look at them again. Each time, I notice something new. The way the creature's muscles moved under its fur, the strange grace in its posture despite its massive size, the almost human-like awareness in its stance. It's like looking at something that shouldn't exist, yet there it is, captured forever in 3 frames taken over 15 seconds. The most unsettling part? In all my years of wildlife photography, I've never captured anything that moved so deliberately, so purposefully. Every other animal I've photographed shows some sign of randomness in their movements, head turns, pauses, natural behavior. This thing, it moved like it had an agenda, like it knew exactly what it was doing. I still photograph wildlife in Colorado's mountains, but something changed after that night. I'm more cautious now. I pay attention to that feeling in your gut when something's not right. And sometimes, when I'm setting up my cameras in remote locations, I can't shake the feeling that something out there is watching, waiting, and far more aware than any natural animal should be. Those 15 seconds changed how I see our wilderness. There are things out there we don't understand, things that don't fit into our neat categories of known wildlife. And sometimes, if you're really unlucky, they notice you noticing them. Story 8. It was early October 2015, and we were doing our usual hunting trip up near Concrete, Washington. Mark and I had been hunting partners for about 6 years at that point, and we knew that area of Mount Baker pretty well, or at least we thought we did. We'd always gone after deer in that region because the hunting was usually good, and we knew all the best spots away from other hunters. That year had been different, though. From the start of hunting season, we'd noticed fewer deer than usual. Even the usual signs, tracks, droppings, rubbed trees, seemed scarce. We figured maybe the harsh winter had pushed them to different areas, so we decided to explore deeper into the wilderness than we usually did. We'd been out since dawn that morning, following some promising tracks we'd found. The weather was typical for October in the Pacific Northwest. Overcast, cool, probably around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light drizzle that came and went. The forest was thick with Douglas firs and western red cedars, and the ground was covered in that thick moss that just soaks up every sound. Around 2 p.m., we came across something that stopped us in our tracks. About 12 feet up in the trees, there was this structure. I've been hunting for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it. It wasn't some random collection of fallen branches or storm damage. This thing was clearly built. The branches were woven together in this complex pattern, creating this sort of platform or nest about 8 feet across. What really got to us was that this wasn't made with dead branches. Some of these had been clearly twisted and bent while still alive and growing. That was weird enough, but what we found inside made my blood run cold. There were the remains of a deer up there. Not just pieces of one, but most of a deer carcass partially eaten. Now, I know what bear kills look like. This wasn't that. The deer hadn't been torn apart like a bear would do. It was almost methodically taken apart. And there was no way a bear built that structure. The rain had picked up a bit by then, and something about the whole scene felt wrong. You know that feeling when you suddenly realize you're somewhere you absolutely shouldn't be? That's what hit me. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just the sound of rain on leaves. Mark was already collecting some of the hair samples we found snagged on the branches. He works in wildlife biology, so he's always thinking about documentation. I was just trying to process what I was looking at. That's when we heard it. It started as this low rumble, almost like distant thunder, but it changed into this long, deep vocalization that I can't even properly describe. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't an elk. It was deeper, more powerful, and it seemed to come from something with a much larger chest cavity than any animal I know. The sound lasted for maybe 15 seconds, and it felt like it was coming from about half a mile away, to the north of us. We looked at each other, and I could see my own fear reflected in Mark's face. We'd both been in the woods enough to know every animal sound in the Pacific Northwest. This was something else entirely. We decided to make camp about a mile away from the structure. Yeah, maybe not the smartest decision, but we were deep in the woods, it was getting late, and we wanted to document whatever was going on. We set up our camp in a small clearing, built a fire, and kept our rifles close. That night was the longest of my life. Around 10 p.m. we started hearing movement in the forest around us. Heavy footsteps, but not like a bear or elk. These were more deliberate, almost human-like, but much heavier. The footsteps would stop for long periods, then start again from a different direction. Whatever it was circling our camp. The worst part was the smell that came with it. I've smelled dead animals, bear musk, all sorts of things in the woods. This was different, like a combination of wet dog, rotting meat, and something skunky, but much stronger. The smell would come in waves, stronger when the footsteps were closer. Around midnight, we heard another one of those vocalizations, but much closer this time. It was answered by another call from further away. The sound was so powerful it seemed to vibrate in my chest. Then we heard wood knocking, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree. 3 distinct knocks from one direction, then 2 knocks in response from another direction. We barely slept that night. Every time we'd start to doze off, there'd be another sound, branches breaking, those heavy footsteps, or more of those haunting calls. By dawn, whatever had been stalking us was gone, but we found tracks around our camp. Big tracks. Some were partially filled with water from the rain, but one was clear enough, about 16 inches long, humanoid, with 5 toes. The stride length between them was huge, probably around 6 feet. We spent the next 2 nights in the area, and each night we heard similar vocalizations. On the 3rd night, around 2 a.m., something large moved through the branches above our camp. The movement was controlled, deliberate. Whatever it was using the trees to move around. That's when we decided we'd had enough. When we got back to civilization, Mark sent the hair samples he'd collected to a lab where he had some connections. The results came back inconclusive. They couldn't match it to any known species, but the DNA analysis suggested some kind of primate. We reported everything to the local rangers, and they told us there had been other similar reports that year. 5 other groups had reported strange structures in the trees and unusual vocalizations. I've been back to those woods since then, but never to that specific area. Something about that experience changed me. I've spent my whole life in the outdoors, but I've never felt like such an intruder as I did during those 3 days. Whatever we encountered out there, it was intelligent, it was organized, and it was definitely watching us. The strange thing is, after those 3 days, all activity in that area just stopped. The rangers did a sweep of the area a week later and found nothing. The structure was gone. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. It was like whatever was there had simply vanished. I still go hunting, but now I pay attention to different things. I notice when the forest goes quiet. I look up in the trees more often. And sometimes, when I'm deep in the woods, I get that feeling again. That feeling of being watched. But I've never seen anything like what we encountered that October, and part of me hopes I never do again. To this day, Mark and I don't talk much about what happened. The few times we've brought it up, we both get this uneasy feeling. We're both rational guys, used to being in the wilderness, but what we experienced those 3 days defied any rational explanation. The samples, the tracks, the structures, it was all real, tangible evidence of something that shouldn't exist, but does. I've read other people's encounters since then, and many of them describe similar things. The tree structures, the sounds, the methodical movement patterns. Each story helps me feel less crazy about what we experienced, but it also confirms my suspicions that there's something out there that we can't explain. Something that's intelligent enough to remain hidden, yet occasionally lets its presence be known in ways that leave no doubt about its existence. Story 9. I've worked as a forest ranger at Militan Lake for over 2 decades now, but what I encountered back in '99 still keeps me up some nights. I've never shared this publicly before, but I feel like I need to get this off my chest. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what I saw, but I can't explain it away. This happened in late October 1999. during what started as a routine patrol of the northern section. The morning was unusually quiet, that heavy kind of silence that makes the hair on your neck stand up. It was around 7:30 a.m., overcast and cool, probably mid-50s. I was checking a remote area about 4 miles from the nearest access road, in a section we rarely patrolled because it was so isolated. The terrain there is rough, lots of dense oak and pine, with steep ravines that make it nearly impossible to navigate unless you really know the area. I noticed something odd right away. There was a strong, musty smell, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation. At first I figured maybe there was a dead animal nearby, but this was different. The smell would come and go with the wind, but it was definitely stronger in certain spots. As I moved deeper into the area, I started finding broken branches about 8-9 feet up on some trees. Now, I've dealt with black bears plenty of times, but these breaks were different. They were twisted off, not just snapped, and they were way too high for a bear. That's when I noticed the first nest. I've seen all kinds of animal beds and dens over the years, but this stopped me in my tracks. It was a massive circular depression in the ground, about 8 feet across, where all the vegetation had been compressed and woven together. The weaving wasn't random. Whatever made it had deliberately tucked branches and grass in a specific pattern. The whole thing was like a giant bird's nest, but on the ground. My heart nearly stopped when I realized there were 2 more nests nearby, arranged in a perfect triangle, each about 30 feet apart. Each one was identical in size and construction. Inside one of them, I found dark, coarse hairs, about 3-4 inches long. They weren't bear hair. I know what that looks like. These were thicker, almost like horsehair, but different. I started taking soil samples and photographing everything. I always carried basic collection supplies in my patrol kit. That's when the woods got even quieter, if that was possible. You know how it normally is in the forest. There's always some background noise, birds, insects, something. But it was like someone had hit a mute button. Even the wind seemed to die down. Then I heard it, a deep, wooden knocking sound, like someone hitting a tree with a baseball bat, but much heavier. It came from about 200 yards to my west. Then another knock responded from the opposite direction. I've been in these woods for 20 years, and I'd never heard anything like it. I was documenting the third nest when movement caught my eye. About 100 yards away, across a small clearing, something stepped out from behind a cluster of oaks. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. It was bipedal, at least 8 feet tall, with dark, almost black hair covering its entire body. The way it moved was what really got me, completely fluid like an athlete, not at all like someone in a costume. I froze, completely froze. 20 years of training, and I just stood there, heart pounding so hard I could hear it. The creature moved across the clearing with these long, smooth strides. Its arms were massive, hanging down past its knees. The head sat directly on its shoulders, no neck like a human would have. The face. I couldn't make out details at that distance, but it was dark, and the forehead sloped back sharply. What really struck me was how it moved through the brush, totally silent. Something that size should have made noise, but it was like watching a shadow move. It crossed the clearing in maybe 6 or 7 steps, then disappeared into the tree line on the other side. I'd love to say I immediately ran after it or took photos, but honestly I was terrified. It took me several minutes to even move. When I finally did approach the spot where it had crossed, the vegetation was crushed down in a clear path. The footprints. I found 3 clear ones in some softer soil. They were bare feet but huge, about 16 inches long with 5 distinct toes. The stride length between them was over 6 feet. I took more samples, soil from the footprints, hair samples from where some brush had snagged it, bark from trees where there were marks. I photographed everything. But here's the thing that still bothers me. When I got back to submit the samples for analysis, things got weird. My supervisor took everything, said it would all be sent to the state lab, but I never saw any results. When I followed up a few weeks later, he said they'd been inconclusive. When I pressed for more details, he just changed the subject. The whole area was declared off-limits for ecological study a month later. No one was allowed in without special permission. I requested to patrol that section again multiple times, but was always assigned elsewhere. The few times I managed to get near that area in the following months, I noticed increased activity. Vehicles I didn't recognize, people in civilian clothes carrying equipment I'd never seen before. The knocking sounds continued sporadically for about 2 months after my encounter, always distant, always at dawn or dusk. Then they just stopped. The nests were gone when spring came, not just deteriorated but completely removed. Even the compressed vegetation underneath had been cleared away. I still have copies of my photos from that day, though they're not great. Just a basic department-issued camera back then. The footprint photos are the clearest, but the photos of the creature itself, all you can really make out is a dark shape moving between trees. Classic, right? But I know what I saw. I've never gone public with this before because, well, I like my job. But I've spent 25 years in these woods. I know every animal that lives here, every track, every sound. What I saw that day doesn't match anything known to science. Those nests, the footprints, the hair samples, there was something deliberate and intelligent about all of it. The weirdest part, about a week after the incident, I ran into one of the old-timers who lived on the edge of the park. He took one look at my face and said, "You saw it, didn't you?" Wouldn't say another word after that, just nodded and walked away. Turns out there had been stories about that area going back decades. Hunters finding similar nests, hearing the knocks, glimpsing something huge moving through the trees. But nobody ever made official reports. I still patrol Militan Lake, but I've never seen anything like that again. Sometimes early in the morning when the fog rolls in thick, I catch that same musty smell on the wind. And sometimes, very rarely, I'll hear a distant knock echoing through the trees. But whatever I encountered that day seems to have moved on, leaving behind nothing but questions and a handful of photographs that don't prove anything. The samples I collected? No idea what happened to them. My supervisor retired a few years later, and his replacement claimed to have no knowledge of any analysis or results. The area is open for patrol again now, but the nests never reappeared. It's like the whole thing never happened. I've responded to hundreds of calls about strange sounds and unexplained sightings over my career. Most of them have simple explanations: bears, mountain lions, even the occasional lost livestock. But what I saw that October morning, that was something else entirely. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I know what I saw. And I know those nests weren't made by any known animal in these woods. The longer I've worked in these forests, the more I've realized how little we actually know about what lives in them. There are places so remote, so untouched, that anything could be living there. What I encountered that day made me question everything I thought I knew about these woods. And maybe that's the way it should be. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. But I still check the trees for broken branches when I patrol. And sometimes, when I pass near that clearing, I stop and listen, just in case those knocks echo through the trees again. Story 10. It was January 12th, 2019. We'd had a light snow the night before, just enough to dust the ground, maybe half an inch. I remember because I was actually grateful for the thin coverage. It meant I wouldn't have to spend hours plowing. I got up early like usual, around 5:30 a.m. to do my morning checks. The temperature was hovering around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was this eerie stillness in the air that you only get after a snowfall. I started my routine check of the property in my pickup, driving along the perimeter of my cornfield. The field spans about 40 acres, and I'd left some stalks standing through winter as ground cover. The sun wasn't up yet, but I had my floodlights on, and that's when I first noticed something was off. From the truck I could see these impressions in the snow, cutting straight across my field. At first I thought maybe some local kids had been trespassing, but something didn't sit right. I pulled over and grabbed my flashlight from the glove box. The moment I stepped out of the truck, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was dead quiet. No birds, no small animals rustling around, nothing. Anyone who lives in the country knows that's not normal, even in winter. When I reached the first footprint, my stomach dropped. I've been hunting all my life, tracked deer, bear, you name it. These prints were nothing like anything I'd ever seen. They were huge. I laid my 12-inch work boot next to one for comparison, and it extended a good 3 inches beyond both ends. But it wasn't just the size that disturbed me, it was the depth and the spacing. The prints were sunk deep into the ground, through the snow, and into the soil beneath. Whatever made these would have to be incredibly heavy to compress the semi-frozen ground like that. And the stride length. I measured it with my tape measure. 6 feet between steps. Not jumping, not running, but walking, in a perfectly straight line across my field. I followed the tracks, taking photos with my phone as I went. They continued for about 300 yards, cutting through my cornfield like a ruler had been laid down. No human walks that straight, especially not through a field with cornstalks. Every hunter knows you weave a bit, following the path of least resistance. These tracks just plowed straight through. That's when I remembered my security cameras. I'd installed them last summer, after having issues with equipment tampering. I rushed back to the house to check the footage from the previous night. My hands were shaking as I rewound through the recordings. At 2:17 a.m., camera 3, which faces the tree line at the north end of my property, caught something. Even with the infrared, it was hard to make out details, but what I saw still chills me. A large, dark figure moved between the trees. The camera's field of view covers about 30 feet of the tree line, and whatever it was cleared that distance in 3 strides. The movement wasn't like a bear's lumbering gait or a human's walk. It was fluid, purposeful, and disturbingly quick for its size. I called the DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, that morning. I'm not one for crying wolf, but this was way outside my expertise. 2 officers came out around 10 a.m. They took the whole thing seriously, which surprised me. They photographed the tracks, took measurements, and collected plaster casts. They were particularly interested in the depth and stride length. One of the officers, a guy who'd been with the department for 25 years, pulled me aside. He told me they'd received similar reports from 3 other properties in the county over the past month. All after light snowfall, all with the same bizarre track patterns. The tracks led into a heavily wooded area at the edge of my property. The officers followed them for about a quarter mile before they disappeared, where the snow thinned out under the tree canopy. They found broken branches high up, way higher than a bear could reach, some as high as 8 feet off the ground, fresh breaks from that same night. What really got to me was what they found near where the tracks ended. There was an area where the ground had been cleared of debris, not scattered like an animal foraging, but deliberately swept clean in a rough circle about 7 feet in diameter. The officers took more photos but wouldn't say much about it. Later that day, I went back out to look at the tracks again, but the rising temperature had started to melt the snow, distorting them. By evening, they were mostly gone. If I hadn't taken those photos, and if the DEC hadn't made those casts, I might have convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. That night, I kept the floodlights on and stayed up late, watching the monitors. Around 1 a.m., all the local coyotes started howling at once, then went dead silent. The kind of silence that feels heavy, oppressive. My dogs, 2 German shepherds who aren't afraid of anything, crowded into the house and wouldn't stop whining. I checked the cameras but didn't see anything. Still, I could feel something, like the whole property was holding its breath. The next few weeks I installed more cameras and motion sensors. Never caught anything as clear as that first night, but there were incidents. Tools moved in the barn. Deep grunting sounds from the woods late at night. One morning I found a half-eaten deer carcass in my field. Not unusual in itself, but it had been carried to that spot. The drag marks in the mud made that clear. What was strange was that the deer had been carried at least 6 feet off the ground. The blood drops and bits of fur were caught in the higher branches of the trees it passed under. The DEC eventually closed their investigation. Officially, they called it inconclusive. They suggested it might have been a large black bear with an unusual gait, but their tone made it clear they didn't believe that any more than I did. One of the officers quietly told me that the stride length and print depth would suggest something weighing at least 800 pounds, walking on 2 legs. I've lived in Steuben County my whole life, and I know what bears look like. I know what bears can do. This wasn't a bear. Whatever walked through my field that night was something else. Something that, by all logic, shouldn't exist. But those tracks were real. That figure on my security camera was real. And sometimes, on cold winter nights when the snow is falling, I still hear heavy footsteps out in my field, moving with that same impossible stride length, in that same straight line. I've never been a believer in the unexplained, I'm a farmer. I deal in facts, in things I can see and touch and understand. But what happened that night forced me to accept that there are things in our woods that defy explanation. I still farm the same land, but I don't go out at night anymore unless I absolutely have to. And when I do, I can't shake the feeling that something's watching me from the tree line, something that's been walking these woods long before I ever claimed this land as my own. Story 11. As a geologist, I'm trained to look at evidence, to be methodical, to question everything. What happened near Forks, Washington in 2005 completely shattered my understanding of what's possible. I've spent countless nights trying to rationalize it, but I can't. I need to get this off my chest. I was part of a 5-person geological survey team mapping the Olympic Peninsula's western slopes. It was early October, and we were about 15 miles east of Forks, in some of the most remote terrain you can find in the continental US. The area was a maze of old-growth forest with some trees wider than my car. Our team included myself, 2 other geologists, Mark and Sarah, and 2 field technicians, Dave and Tom. That particular day started like any other. We'd been in the field for 3 days, collecting soil samples and mapping geological formations. The weather was typical for the Olympic Peninsula, overcast, cool, with that constant moisture in the air that makes everything feel damp. We were working our way up a steep ravine when Dave called us over to something unusual. At first I thought we were looking at storm damage, fallen trees and debris. But as we got closer, I realized this was different. There was a structure, for lack of a better word. Someone, or something, had deliberately arranged massive logs and branches into a crude shelter. This wasn't some kid's fort or a homeless camp. We were miles from the nearest trail, in terrain so rough that just getting there with our equipment had been a challenge. The shelter was huge, maybe 8 feet tall at its highest point, with an opening large enough for something big to walk through. What really caught my attention were the branches. They weren't broken by wind or natural forces. They were twisted off, with clear signs of being manipulated by something with tremendous strength. Some of these branches were 4, 5 inches thick. Inside, we found something that made my stomach turn. There were piles of partially eaten salmon, some still fresh enough that they couldn't have been there more than a day or 2. Mixed in were half-eaten berries and what looked like chewed-up vegetation. The smell was distinctive, like a mix of wet dog, rotting fish, and something musky I can't even describe. It's a smell that still haunts me. Sarah, our team's botanist, identified the vegetation as local salmonberries and thimbleberries. But what really got to us was the way the salmon had been eaten. These weren't torn apart by bears or other predators we were familiar with. The fish were methodically stripped, almost like someone had peeled them. We documented everything, took samples, and marked the GPS coordinates. That's when we started finding the footprints near a small stream about 50 yards from the shelter. I've seen bear prints, elk prints, every kind of wildlife track you can imagine in the Pacific Northwest. These were different. They were clearly footprints, humanoid footprints, but massive. We measured them at 17 inches long. The stride length between prints was over 6 feet. That night at camp, about a quarter mile from the shelter site, things got weird. Around 9 p.m., we started hearing wood knocks. If you've never heard them in the wilderness, it's hard to describe. Imagine someone taking a baseball bat to a hollow tree, that deep, resonant thud that carries through the forest. But what made it truly unnerving was that they were answered. One knock would come from one direction, then another would answer from somewhere else, then a third from yet another location. We huddled around our camp, all pretending we weren't terrified. Our camp was well equipped. We had satellite phones, GPS units, even a small electric fence for bears. None of that made us feel any safer. The knocking continued for hours, moving around us in a way that felt deliberate, coordinated. Around midnight, the forest went completely silent. If you've spent time in the wilderness, you know that's never a good sign. No insects, no night birds, nothing. Just dead silence. Then we smelled it. That same musky odor from the shelter, but stronger, much stronger. That's when we heard the breathing. Deep, heavy breathing from something big. It was moving around our camp, just outside the range of our lights. We could hear heavy footsteps, the sound of branches being pushed aside. Whatever it was huge, and there was more than one of them. For 3 terrifying hours they circled our camp. None of us dared move. We could hear them communicating with low grunts and what sounded almost like whispers, but in no language I've ever heard. The satellite phone had no signal. We were completely cut off. Just before dawn, they left. The forest sounds gradually returned, and we could feel the tension break. When daylight came, we found more footprints all around our camp, some clear enough to make casts of. We also found fresh scat piles that contained deer hair and local vegetation. The lab analysis later confirmed this, though the results were inconclusive about the source. Over the next 4 nights, the pattern repeated. Wood knocks starting at dusk, followed by hours of activity around our camp. We found new shelters, 5 in total, all within a 2-mile radius. Each had similar signs of occupation, food remains, bedding made from broken branches and vegetation, and that unmistakable smell. On our last night, something changed. The activity started earlier, before sunset. The knocking was more intense, more frequent. Then we heard what I can only describe as screaming. Not animal, not human, but something in between. It started as a low moan that built into a howl that made my bones shake. The sound carried for miles. You could feel it in your chest. That's when we saw one. It stepped into a clearing about 100 yards from our camp, just at the edge of dusk. Even in the failing light, I could make out its massive frame, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair. It moved with an eerily smooth gait, bipedal, but with a grace that seemed impossible for something that size. Its arms hung down past its knees, and its head sat directly on its shoulders, no neck like a human has. For maybe 30 seconds it stood there, swaying slightly, watching us. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its eyes on us. Then it made a sound, a deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from its chest. 2 more answers came from the forest behind it. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it turned and melted back into the forest. We heard them moving away, branches breaking under their weight, those same odd vocalizations growing fainter. The next morning we packed up and left. We filed our geological report but kept most of what we'd seen to ourselves. Who would believe us? I still have the plaster casts of those footprints in my garage. The photos we took are stored away. They're not great quality in the dim light, but they show enough to keep me up at night sometimes. I've spent years trying to rationalize what we experienced. I've read every scientific paper I could find on known primates, bears, and other large mammals. Nothing explains what we encountered. The coordinated behavior, the structures, the tool use implied by how they process their food, it all suggests an intelligence we're not prepared to acknowledge exists. I still work as a geologist, but I haven't gone back to that part of the Olympic Peninsula. Sometimes when I'm in the field and I hear a branch break or catch a whiff of something musky on the wind, I freeze. Every instinct tells me to run, because now I know we're not alone in these forests. There's something out there, something intelligent, something that's managed to stay hidden despite our best efforts to find it. Those 5 days changed how I see the world. There are things in these woods that science can't explain yet. I know what I saw, what my whole team saw. I just don't know what to do with that knowledge. Story 12. What happened to me and my crew at the old Harrison mine outside Beckley still haunts me, even though it's been several years now. I was the foreman of a small maintenance team that did regular structural checks on abandoned mines in the area. You know, making sure the supports weren't failing and that there weren't any environmental hazards developing. It was mid-October 2017, and we had a routine inspection scheduled for the Harrison site. It's about 12 miles outside of town, tucked away in this dense stretch of forest that's grown wild since the mine shut down in the 90s. The place always gave me the creeps, but what happened that day? I still get chills thinking about it. There were 4 of us, me, Dave, Mike, and Chris. We'd been doing these inspections together for about 3 years at that point. The day started normal enough. We got to the site around 7:30 a.m. It was one of those crisp fall mornings, temperature probably in the low 50s, with this heavy fog hanging between the trees. The kind of fog that makes everything look different, plays tricks on your eyes. First thing that felt off was the silence. Usually these woodland areas are pretty noisy in the morning. Birds, squirrels, all that normal forest stuff. But that day, it was dead quiet. Mike mentioned it first, said something felt wrong. We kind of laughed it off, but looking back, that should have been our first warning. We parked our trucks about 200 yards from the mine entrance and started unloading our gear. Light stands, testing equipment, cameras for documenting any structural issues. The mine entrance was overgrown, but we'd kept a path cleared for our monthly checks. As we were setting up, this smell hit us. Now, old mines often have weird smells, mold, standing water, that sort of thing. But this was different. It was like rotting garbage mixed with wet dog, but way stronger. It was so bad it made my eyes water. Chris actually threw up. We'd never smelled anything like it in all our inspections. Dave suggested maybe something had died nearby, but this smell, it wasn't exactly like decay. It was worse, and it seemed to come and go with the wind. We pushed on with our work, though every instinct was telling me to leave. About an hour in, we were documenting some routine stuff, taking moisture readings, checking support beam integrity, when we heard this crash through the trees to our right, maybe 100 yards off. It sounded like something big moving through the brush, breaking branches. We all stopped and listened. Then we heard it, this deep rumbling vocalization that I still can't properly describe. It wasn't a bear's growl or anything I'd ever heard in these woods before. It was almost like someone trying to imitate whale sounds, but deeper and more guttural. Mike had his phone out and managed to record some of it. The recording doesn't do it justice, but it's still chilling to listen to. That's when we saw it. Through the fog and trees, this massive dark figure was moving parallel to us. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks, but then it stopped. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair. The thing that struck me most was how it moved, not like a bear on hind legs, but smoothly, like a person, but huge. We all froze. Nobody said a word. The creature stood there, partially hidden by a large oak tree, just watching us. The smell got overwhelming, and I realized it was coming from this thing. What happened next is burned into my memory. The creature stepped forward, and in the clearer view, we could see it was carrying something. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing. It was a dead deer, carried almost casually, like how you'd carry a grocery bag. The deer was a good-sized buck, probably 150 pounds at least, but this thing handled it like it was nothing. Chris started backing up toward the trucks, and I wanted to tell him to move slowly, but I couldn't get my voice to work. The creature's head turned to follow his movement, and that's when I got the best look at its face. It was almost human-like, but not quite. The brow was massive, and the eyes, they showed intelligence. That's what scared me the most. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. There was purpose in those eyes. Suddenly it made this huffing sound and turned away, moving deeper into the forest with shocking speed for something so large. The deer was still dangling from its hand as it disappeared into the trees. We could hear branches breaking for several seconds afterward, then nothing. We didn't even discuss it. We just grabbed our essential gear and got the hell out of there. The whole encounter probably lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. Back at the trucks, we found huge footprints in a muddy area we'd walked past earlier. They were human-shaped but massive, easily 16 inches long. Mike took photos with his phone next to them for scale. When we reported it to the local authorities, they seemed more interested than I expected. Turns out there had been other sightings in the area, but nothing this clear or with multiple witnesses. They sent out a team the next day, and they found the area where the creature had apparently been staying. There was this clearing where the vegetation was all pressed down in a circular pattern about 12 feet in diameter. They found animal bones scattered around and these weird structures made of broken branches. The company suspended inspections at that site for a while after that. When we finally went back about 6 months later, we went with armed guards. We never saw the creature again, but sometimes we'd find fresh footprints or hear those vocalizations in the distance. The smell would come back too, always making us hurry through our work. What bothers me most isn't just what we saw that day. It's knowing that thing is probably still out there. Sometimes when I'm driving home late at night and pass by wooded areas, I catch myself scanning the tree line. The rational part of my brain tries to explain it away, but I know what I saw. 4 of us saw it, clear as day. I've spent countless hours since then reading about other encounters, trying to make sense of it all. Some people don't believe us, and that's fine. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I know what's out there in those woods. And I know that sometimes, when I'm alone at night and hear something moving outside, my mind goes right back to that foggy morning at Harrison Mine. The company still does inspections at that site, but I transferred to desk duty shortly after. Call me a coward, but I've seen enough. Dave and Mike still work the inspection routes, but they never go to Harrison Mine without at least 6 people now. Chris quit altogether, moved to Florida, where he says the only things he has to worry about are alligators and tourists. I've never told this story publicly before. For years I kept it between just us and the authorities who investigated. But lately, I've been hearing about more sightings in the area, and I feel like people need to know what's out there. I'm not saying to avoid the woods or live in fear, just be aware. And if you're ever in the woods around Beckley and smell something terrible like rotting garbage and wet dog, don't stick around to investigate. Some mysteries are better left alone. Story 13. I've never been much of a writer, and I still get chills thinking about what my wife Susan and I experienced at our home in 2003. But I need to get this off my chest. We lived in a fairly remote area, just outside Grants Pass, Oregon, in a house we'd bought in late 2002. It sat on about 5 acres of land, mostly wooded, with the Rogue River about a mile away. We loved the privacy and the fruit trees. We had several apple and pear trees that previous owners had planted. The first strange thing started happening in early March 2003. At first, it was just our trash cans getting knocked over at night. I blamed it on bears or raccoons. We'd had issues with them before, but something felt off about it. The trash wasn't just scattered, it looked methodically picked through, and the weird part, they only took certain things, fruit peels, vegetable scraps, that kind of stuff, never the packaged foods or anything else. By April, we started noticing our fruit trees were being stripped bare way too early in the season. The crazy thing was the height. Something was taking fruit from branches 12, 14 feet up, way too high for deer to reach. And these weren't clean breaks. The branches were literally twisted off. I found one branch that was nearly 2 inches thick, just snapped like a twig. That's when the sounds started. God, those sounds. They'd start around 2 or 3 a.m., these deep rumbling whoops that would echo through the trees. Sometimes they sounded almost like words, but not quite human. Other times it was more like singing, but so deep it made the windows vibrate. Susan described it as whale songs, but wrong somehow. We'd hear them calling back and forth to each other, sometimes close, sometimes far away, like they were coordinating. I'm not some paranoid guy who jumps at shadows. I've been hunting since I was a kid, spent countless nights in the woods. But this was different. The woods around our house just felt watched. You know that feeling when someone's staring at you? Multiply that by 100. Even during the day, I'd be working in the yard and get this overwhelming urge to run inside. By May, I'd set up some cheap security cameras and started recording the sounds on an old tape recorder. The cameras never caught anything clear, just shadows moving between trees, always just out of frame. But the size of these shadows. One night, something moved past our rear floodlight, and the shadow it cast reached from the ground almost to our second-story window. That's at least 12 feet tall. The footprints started showing up in June. After heavy rain, we'd find them in the mud around the house. The smallest ones were about 10 inches, still bigger than any human foot I've ever seen. But the big ones, I measured one at 18.2 inches. I took plaster casts, tons of photos. The detail in them was incredible. You could see individual toe movements, skin texture. These weren't some hoax prints stamped in the ground. What really got to me was how they moved as a group. You could follow the tracks and see how they coordinated. The bigger ones always on the outside, the smaller tracks protected in the middle, like a family unit. We'd find places where they'd stopped, probably to pick fruit or dig up roots. The ground would be torn up with knuckle prints where they'd braced themselves. The worst night was in late July. The temperature had dropped unusually low for summer, and the fog had rolled in thick. Around midnight, we started hearing the wood knocks. They have this specific pattern: 3 quick hits, pause, 2 hits, pause, repeat. It was like they were surrounding the house, communicating with these knocks. We could hear heavy footsteps on our deck, but every time I'd shine a light out there, they'd already moved. Then something started testing our doors. Not violently, just slowly turning the handles, applying pressure. We could hear their breathing through the door. Deep, rhythmic breaths that sounded almost human, but bigger. Susan was recording everything on her phone, and I had my hunting rifle ready, though I honestly don't know if I could have pulled the trigger. These weren't animals acting on instinct. There was intelligence behind their actions. Around 3 a.m., they gathered under our bedroom window. Must have been at least 4 of them, judging by the different pitches in their calls. They started making these almost conversational sounds, not the usual whoops or knocks, but something that sounded eerily like talking. One would make this series of low rumbles and clicks, then another would respond. This went on for almost an hour. We took our recordings to a friend who works in audio engineering. He ran them through some professional software, comparing them to known animal sounds. Nothing matched. The frequency ranges were all wrong for any known North American wildlife. He said the vocals showed signs of complex language patterns, but unlike anything he'd ever studied. The activity peaked in August. We'd find complex structures in the woods, branches woven together into what looked like temporary shelters. They'd leave weird arrangements of sticks and stones on our deck, not random piles, but deliberate patterns. One morning, we found all our apples arranged in a perfect spiral on the ground, each one with a single bite taken out of it. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped in early September. No more sounds, no footprints, no stolen fruit. Even the heavy feeling of being watched lifted. The last trace we found was a set of tracks leading down toward the river, the whole family group heading north. The prints got fainter and fainter until they disappeared completely. We still live in the same house. Haven't had any more incidents since then. Sometimes on quiet nights, we'll hear distant wood knocks from deep in the forest, but they never come close anymore. We've shown our evidence to a few researchers over the years. Some dismiss it, others spend hours analyzing our recordings and casts. I don't try to convince anyone anymore. I know what we experienced. Those 6 months changed how I view the world. There are things in our forests that defy explanation. Intelligent things that we barely understand. They weren't aggressive, despite their size and strength. If anything, they seemed curious about us, like they were studying us as much as we were studying them. I've kept all our recordings, photos, and casts. Sometimes I go through them, making sure it all really happened. The detailed analysis of the audio recordings provides the most compelling evidence, frequencies and patterns that shouldn't exist in nature, but clearly do. But it's the memories of those nights, listening to what sounded like a family talking to each other outside our window, that really stick with me. They were so close to human, yet so fundamentally different. To this day, I can't eat apples without thinking about that spiral pattern we found, each one with that single massive bite mark. Whoever, or whatever, they were, they wanted us to know they were there. They wanted us to understand something. I just wish I knew what it was. I don't expect everyone to believe this story. Hell, if someone had told me this before it happened, I probably wouldn't have believed it either. But I know what we experienced over those 6 months was real. Sometimes, late at night, I still find myself listening for those wood knocks, part of me hoping to hear them again, part of me praying I never do. Story 14. It was November 12th, 2021. Me, my brother-in-law Pete, and our friend Mike had been planning this deer hunting trip for months. We'd been hunting in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan for years, but this time we decided to try a new spot about 15 miles northwest of Iron Mountain. Mike had heard from some locals about good deer activity in that area, though they also mentioned some weird stuff about missing pets and livestock in the region. We didn't think much of it at the time, figured it was probably just wolves or coyotes. We arrived at our spot around 6 a.m. The weather was unusually warm for November in the UP, around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light drizzle that had stopped just before dawn. The ground was soft and muddy from the rain, and a thick fog hung between the trees, reducing visibility to maybe 100 yards at best. We parked Mike's truck at the end of an old logging road and grabbed our gear, our rifles, day packs, and trail cameras. We'd planned to set up in different spots and meet back at the truck at sunset. I'd been in my spot for maybe 2 hours, perched in my tree stand, when I noticed something odd. The area I was watching had these young birch trees, probably 15, 20 feet tall, and I kept thinking they looked wrong somehow. It took me a while to figure out what was bothering me, but then it hit me. Several of them were bent over in perfect arches, forming what looked like a corridor through the woods. Not broken or damaged, but deliberately bent and twisted. I'd been hunting for 20 years and never seen anything like it. It wasn't wind damage. These trees were literally woven together in places. I called Pete on the radio to tell him what I'd found. He was about half a mile east of my position, and Mike was somewhere north of us. Pete said he'd come check it out, and about 15 minutes later, he arrived at my location. The moment he saw the bent trees, his face changed. He'd been hunting these woods his whole life too, and I could tell he was as unsettled as I was. We decided to follow this corridor of bent trees. The formation continued for about 200 yards, and that's when we found the tracks. At first, we thought they were bear tracks, but something wasn't right. These prints were huge, about 15 inches long, and they showed 5 distinct toes. They were deeply pressed into the mud, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. We took photos with our phones, placing Pete's hunting knife next to them for scale. The really weird thing was the pattern of the tracks. They didn't meander like a bear's would. They went in a straight line, like a person walking with purpose. We followed them for a while, and that's when we noticed the hair. Caught in the low branches along the path were these thick, coarse black hairs, much too long to be from a bear. We collected some in a Ziploc bag. I still have them at home. By this point, Mike had joined us too. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were all thinking the same thing. Those stories about Bigfoot that we'd always laughed at, well, they weren't seeming so funny anymore. We spent the rest of the day setting up trail cameras around the area. The weird thing was, we hadn't seen a single deer all day, which was unusual for that time of year. Even the usual squirrels and birds seemed scarce. The woods were unnaturally quiet, like everything was holding its breath. As dusk approached, we decided to stay and do some night observation. We had our thermal scope and night vision equipment. Plus, we'd brought Mike's parabolic microphone. He's kind of a tech geek when it comes to hunting gear. We set up a small camp about 100 yards from the corridor of bent trees. Around 8:30 p.m., the temperature dropped suddenly. I mean really suddenly, like someone had opened a freezer door. The fog had lifted, but there was still this heavy feeling in the air. That's when we started hearing it. It started as this low, rumbling sound, almost below the range of human hearing, but we could feel it. It made the equipment on our camping table vibrate. At first, we thought it might be distant thunder, but the sky was clear. The sound would come and go, each time getting slightly louder. Mike was recording everything with his equipment, and the readings were off the charts. Then we saw the eyes. About 80 yards out, at what we estimated was about 8 feet off the ground, there were 2 reflective red eyes catching the moonlight. Not like a deer's eyes. These were much larger and spaced wider apart. They stayed perfectly still, just watching us. I raised my rifle scope to try to get a better look, but as soon as I did, they disappeared. The next sound we heard, I still get chills thinking about it. It was this deep, guttural vocalization that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. Not a bear, not a wolf, not anything I could identify. It was powerful enough that we could feel it in our chests, like standing next to a huge speaker. Mike's recording equipment actually crackled and shut off when it happened. We heard heavy footsteps moving through the woods, but they seemed to come from multiple directions. Something large was circling our position, staying just out of clear sight. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like whatever it was wanted us to know it was there. We could hear branches snapping under its weight. Around 9:45 p.m., things escalated. We heard what sounded like someone slapping the trunks of trees, loud rhythmic banging that seemed to be answers to each other from different directions. It was like we were surrounded by multiple, whatever these things were. They were communicating with each other, and we were caught in the middle of it. That's when Pete's dog, I haven't mentioned Ranger yet, but he's Pete's trained hunting dog, started acting strange. He'd been quiet all evening, which was unusual for him, but suddenly he started whining and trying to hide under our camping table. Ranger's a 90-pound German shepherd who's never been afraid of anything, but that night he was terrified. The breaking point came around 10:30 p.m. We heard this massive crash about 50 yards behind us, like a small tree being ripped out of the ground. Then we heard it being dragged through the underbrush. That was it. We'd had enough. We grabbed our essential gear, left the rest, and got out of there as fast as we could. Ranger didn't need any encouragement. He was ahead of us the whole way back to the truck. The next morning, we went back with a local conservation officer to document everything. The bent trees were still there, and we found the tracks, though they weren't as clear after the night's frost. We also found a small tree, about 6 inches in diameter, that had been literally pulled out of the ground, roots and all. It would have taken tremendous strength to do that. The conservation officer took our report seriously, but couldn't offer any explanation. He mentioned that they'd had several reports of unusual activity in that area over the past few years, including missing pets and livestock from nearby farms. Some local residents had reported hearing similar vocalizations, but no one had gotten as close as we did. We retrieved our trail cameras, but most of them had malfunctioned during the night. The only images we got were blurry shots of something large moving between the trees, but nothing clear enough to be conclusive. The audio recordings from Mike's equipment were partially corrupted, but the parts that survived clearly captured those deep vocalizations and wood knocks. It's been over a year now, and I still can't explain what we encountered that night. I've been back to that area twice since then, during daylight hours only, but the bent trees are gone now, like they were never there. The whole experience feels like a dream sometimes, but then I look at the photos on my phone or take out that bag of hair we collected, and I know it was real. I've done a lot of research since then, reading about other encounters in the Upper Peninsula. Turns out there's quite a history of similar incidents in that area, going back decades. Local Ojibwe stories talk about large, hairy creatures living in the deepest parts of the forest. They describe them as intelligent beings that mark their territory by bending young trees. I don't know what to believe anymore. I've been a skeptic my whole life, but after what we experienced that night, I can't just dismiss these stories. Whatever's out there in those woods, it's intelligent, it's powerful, and it wants people to know they're in its territory. I still hunt, but never in that area, and never alone. Some things you just don't mess with. The weirdest part? About a month after our encounter, Mike got a call from a biology professor at Northern Michigan University who was interested in the hair samples we collected. Mike sent them to be analyzed, but we never heard back. When we tried to follow up, the professor said the samples had been misplaced. Maybe some things are better left unknown. Story 15. I've been a fishing guide in the Adirondacks for over 15 years, and what happened to me at Tupper Lake in the spring of 2016 still keeps me up at night. I'm finally sharing this because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone else has seen something similar. It was early April, just as the ice was starting to break up on the lake. The fishing season was about to kick off, and I was doing my usual prep work, checking my usual spots around the lake. The weather was typical for that time of year, cloudy, damp, around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, with patches of fog rolling in and out. I remember the date clearly, April 7th, 2016. I'd driven out to my cabin near the northern shore of Tupper Lake around 6 a.m. It's a simple place, just one room with basic amenities, but it's perfect as a base for guide work. The cabin sits about 50 yards from the shoreline, with a decent view of the water through the trees. I've always felt safe there, until that day. The morning started normally enough. I was walking along the shoreline, noting changes from the winter, checking water levels, and looking for any new fallen trees or obstacles I'd need to warn clients about. The lake was dead quiet, that kind of stillness you only get in early spring before all the summer residents return. Around 9 a.m., I noticed something odd near the water's edge. At first, I thought someone had been messing around in the mud, maybe kids or drunk campers. But when I got closer, my blood ran cold. There were footprints, huge ones, coming out of the water. I've tracked deer, bear, and moose my whole life, but these were different. They were clearly foot-shaped, like a massive human print, but at least 14 inches long. The stride length was incredible, easily over 4 feet apart. I'm not some rookie who doesn't know how to read tracks. These were fresh, probably from the previous night or early morning. The way the mud was displaced showed whatever made them was incredibly heavy. What really got me was how clear they were. You could see toe impressions, a distinct arch, and a heel. They weren't bear tracks with melted edges or overlapping deer prints. These were single, distinct footprints that no animal in the Adirondacks should have been able to make. I followed the tracks. They led from the water's edge through a muddy section of shoreline and continued for about 200 yards into a densely wooded area. The prints were consistently spaced and deep. Whatever made them was walking purposefully, not running or acting erratic. The tracks disappeared where the ground got rocky and covered with pine needles, but I could see broken branches higher up than any bear could reach, maybe 8 or 9 feet high. I took some photos with my phone and even used my tape measure, I always carry one to measure fish, to document the prints. I wish I'd made plaster casts, but honestly, at that point, I was still trying to rationalize what I was seeing. As the day went on, I tried to focus on my prep work, but I kept looking over my shoulder. The woods felt different. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It was like that, but 100 times worse. I've spent my whole life in these woods, and I've never felt that kind of primal unease before. I decided to stay in my cabin that night. I know that probably sounds stupid, but I had thousands of dollars worth of gear in my truck, and I couldn't just leave it. Plus, I've dealt with bears and other wildlife before. I had my rifle, and the cabin is solid. I told myself I was being paranoid. Around 8:30 p.m. it started. First, it was just heavy footsteps circling the cabin, slow, deliberate steps that made the ground vibrate slightly. Then came the breathing. Deep, heavy breathing that sounded almost human, but wrong. Too deep, too powerful. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. I killed all the lights and looked out the windows, using my flashlight periodically to scan the darkness. That's when I saw it. About 30 yards from the cabin, standing between 2 large pines, was something that shouldn't exist. It was huge, at least 7.5 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur that looked wet in my flashlight beam. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. It was standing upright with long arms that hung down past its knees. The worst part was its face. It looked almost human-like but primitive, with a pronounced brow ridge and wide nose. Its eyes caught my flashlight and reflected back red, but not like a deer's eyes, more like dark, burning coals. When it saw my light, it didn't run. It just watched me. The smell hit me then, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation and something else, something musky and primitive. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I've gutted plenty of fish and encountered dead animals in various states of decay, but this smell was unique and overwhelming. For what felt like hours, this thing circled my cabin. Sometimes it would stop and just stand there, swaying slightly. Other times it would brush against the walls, making the whole structure creak. I heard it investigating my truck, the sound of massive hands patting the metal. Throughout all this, it made these low, rumbling sounds that I felt more than heard, like infrasound that made my chest vibrate. Around 3 a.m., the noises started to move away. I heard branches breaking in the distance, getting fainter until finally there was just the normal silence of the woods. I didn't sleep. I sat with my rifle, watching the windows until dawn. When morning came, I went outside to check for evidence. The ground around my cabin was torn up with those same huge footprints. There were deep scratches in several trees nearby, far higher than a bear could reach. Tufts of dark hair were caught on some of the bark. The hair was thick and coarse, unlike anything I'd seen before. I called the Department of Environmental Conservation as soon as their office opened. 2 officers came out that afternoon. They took pictures, collected hair samples, and measured everything. They found more tracks and claw marks than I had, leading deep into the woods. One of the officers, an older guy who'd worked in the area for decades, got real quiet as he was documenting everything. When I described what I'd seen, he didn't laugh or dismiss it. He just nodded and took detailed notes. A few weeks later, I heard through the grapevine that the hair samples didn't match any known wildlife in the region. The official report probably says bear activity or something similar, but I know what I saw. I've seen every animal in these woods in every kind of light and weather. This was something else. I still work as a guide on Tupper Lake, but I moved my cabin to a different location. I don't stay out after dark anymore, and I always carry a better flashlight and a more powerful rifle. Sometimes, especially on quiet spring mornings, I see fresh tracks along the shoreline. Same size, same shape. Whatever it was is still out there. I've never told my clients about this. Who would book a fishing guide who talks about monsters in the woods? But every now and then, when the lake gets really still and that heavy silence falls over the trees, I remember that night. I remember those eyes reflecting in my flashlight beam and that deep, powerful breathing circling my cabin in the dark. The weirdest part? Since that night, the fishing has gotten better in that part of the lake, like something's been driving the fish toward the shallow waters. But you couldn't pay me enough to fish that section at dusk. Some things you only need to see once to know better. All. Story 16. It was mid-September, perfect riding weather in Idaho. Me and 3 other guys from our riding group, Mike, Dave, and Kurt, decided to explore some of the lesser-known trails around Clayton. We'd heard about some interesting off-road paths that wound through the Salmon Chalice National Forest, and since we all had dual sports, we figured we'd check them out. We set out early that morning, around 7 a.m. The weather was crisp, probably mid-50s, with a slight overcast that made the riding comfortable. We'd been on the trails for about 3 hours, mostly following old logging roads and game trails, when Dave spotted something odd through the trees. We were about 15 miles northeast of Clayton, in a fairly remote area where the forest gets pretty dense. At first, we thought we were looking at storm damage. You know how sometimes strong winds can knock trees around. But as we got closer, something felt off. These weren't broken trees. They were young pines, probably 15, 20 feet tall, and they were twisted. Not just bent or broken, but actually twisted and woven together, starting at about 10 feet off the ground. We're talking about dozens of trees, all manipulated in ways that shouldn't be possible. I've been in construction for 20 years, and I know what kind of force it takes to bend a young pine tree. These weren't just bent, they were literally braided together like some giant had decided to make a basket out of trees. The weird part was how methodical it looked. This wasn't random storm damage or even the work of a tornado. Every twist, every interweaving seemed purposeful. We killed our engines and got off our bikes to investigate. The silence hit me immediately. You know how the forest usually has some kind of background noise? Birds, insects, wind in the trees? There was nothing. Complete dead silence. That's when Kurt noticed the smell. At first it was faint, kind of metallic like copper pennies in your hand, but then this overwhelming sulfur smell hit us. It was like rotten eggs mixed with something else I couldn't identify. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water. Dave was the first to spot the bone pile. About 30 yards from the twisted trees, there was this carefully arranged stack of bones. Not scattered like you'd expect from predators, but deliberately piled. They were mostly clean, but still had bits of tissue on them. We could tell they were from an elk. The size of the bones and some remaining antler pieces made that clear. But the way they were arranged, it was like someone had sorted them by size and type. Who does that? What does that? That's when Mike grabbed my shoulder. I turned to look at him, and his face had gone completely white. He was staring past me, toward a clearing about 100 yards away. I'll never forget what I saw when I turned around. Standing there, partially obscured by a large pine, was something that shouldn't exist. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe taller. The thing that struck me most wasn't just its height, but its build. This wasn't some guy in a suit. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Its shoulders must have been twice the width of mine, and I'm not a small guy. The creature was covered in dark, matted fur that looked almost reddish-brown in the filtered sunlight. But it was its posture that really got to me. It stood upright, completely bipedal, but with a slight hunch that made it look almost primitive. The way it was watching us, there was intelligence there. Not animal curiosity, but calculated observation. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. None of us moved. None of us spoke. We just stood there, locked in this surreal moment with something that shouldn't exist. The creature's head was massive, set directly on those enormous shoulders with barely any neck visible. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands, not paws, hands, that looked capable of snapping those young trees like twigs. The smell got stronger, and I started feeling lightheaded. Whether it was fear or the overwhelming stench, I'm not sure. That's when we heard it. The sound started as a low rumble, almost subsonic, like you could feel it more than hear it. Then it changed into something between a growl and what I can only describe as wood creaking under enormous pressure. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Kurt was the first to break. He scrambled back toward his bike, nearly falling over himself. That sudden movement seemed to trigger something. The creature shifted its weight, and in that motion I got a clear look at its face. The eyes were deep-set and dark, but they reflected light like a predator's. Its brow ridge was pronounced, giving it an almost angry expression, but what really got me was how human-like some of its features were, while being completely alien at the same time. We all backed away slowly toward our bikes. The creature took one step forward, and the ground actually trembled. It wasn't charging us or showing aggression, but that single step conveyed more power than anything I'd ever seen. As we reached our bikes, it let out another sound, this time a clear, distinctive vocalization that started low and rose in pitch until it was almost a scream. The sound echoed through the trees, and somewhere in the distance we heard a response, a similar call, but further away and deeper. That's when we knew we had to get out of there. We fired up our bikes and took off down the trail we came in on. I've never ridden so fast on off-road terrain in my life. The whole time, that sulfur smell seemed to follow us, and the forest remained eerily silent. We didn't stop until we reached the main road, about 5 miles from Clayton. When we finally pulled over to catch our breath, we tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Dave, who'd been hunting these woods for 30 years, was shaking. He kept saying how the bone pile wasn't natural, how no known predator arranges its kills like that. Mike pointed out marks on the trees we'd passed, huge claw marks about 8 feet up the trunks, too high and too deep to be from any bear. We reported what we found to the local ranger station, but I don't think they took us seriously. A week later, Kurt and I went back with a game camera and some measuring tools. We found the area again, but the bone pile was gone. The twisted trees were still there, though some had been further manipulated. We found fresh tracks, huge human-like footprints that measured 17 inches long and 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. The stride length was over 6 feet. The game camera we left that day disappeared. When we returned 2 days later, we found it crushed to pieces about 50 yards from where we'd mounted it. Whatever did that had to be incredibly strong. It was a heavy-duty steel camera case, designed to withstand bear attacks. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what we saw that day. I've looked into every possible explanation. Bears, moose, even the possibility of other people playing an elaborate prank. Nothing fits. The combination of the twisted trees, the organized bone pile, the tracks, and most importantly, what we saw with our own eyes, it defies conventional explanation. I haven't been back to that specific area since, but I still ride in the Salmon Chalice National Forest. Every time I'm out there, I find myself scanning the trees, looking for signs. Sometimes, when the wind is right, I catch that same metallic sulfuric smell, and my blood runs cold. Whatever we encountered that day, it's still out there, and I'm convinced it wasn't alone. The most unsettling part. Over the years, I've heard similar stories from other riders and hunters in the area. They all mention the twisted trees, the strange smells, and the unnatural silence. Some have found similar bone piles. Few have seen the creature itself, but those who have described it exactly as we saw it. There's something in those woods that we can't explain, something that doesn't fit into our understanding of what's possible. And it's intelligent enough to stay hidden, only revealing itself on its own terms. I still ride my motorcycle almost every weekend, but I never go to that part of the forest alone anymore. Some things you can't unsee, and some experiences change how you look at the world forever. What we encountered that day in Clayton was one of those things. Story 17. It was early December, and I'd been commissioned by a nature magazine to capture some nocturnal wildlife behavior using thermal imaging equipment. I'd done similar work before, but never at such high altitude. My assignment took me to a remote area about 25 miles outside of Pagosa Springs, Colorado, at around 11,000 feet elevation. The location was perfect, a natural clearing surrounded by dense forest with several game trails converging in the area. The first 2 days were uneventful. I set up my main base camp about a quarter-mile from the clearing with a smaller observation post at the clearing's edge. My setup included 2 FLIR thermal cameras, standard night vision equipment, and my regular photography gear. The snow was about knee-deep, making movement difficult, but it was perfect for tracking wildlife. Everything changed on the 3rd night. Around 8:30 p.m., I was in my observation post reviewing some footage when I noticed the wildlife going completely silent. If you spend enough time in the wilderness, you know that sudden silence usually means something big is nearby. I initially thought it might be a mountain lion or bear, though bears should have been hibernating by then. That's when I heard it, a high-pitched vocalization that I can only describe as a cross between a whale song and a wolf howl. It echoed through the valley, bouncing off the mountains in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint its source. My hands were shaking as I switched on all my recording equipment. The temperature was around 15 degrees Fahrenheit that night, and I remember checking my thermometer repeatedly because the cold was really getting to me, even through my winter gear. I was scanning the tree line with my thermal camera when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The thermal image showed a massive heat signature moving through the trees. Unlike the cool blues and greens of the surrounding forest, this was a bright orange-red, indicating a temperature of around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, human body temperature. But what I was looking at was definitely not human. The figure was huge, walking upright, and by comparing it to the surrounding trees, which I had measured earlier for scale reference, I estimated its height at approximately 9 feet. I've spent countless hours observing wildlife through thermal imaging, and I know exactly how bears, elk, and mountain lions appear on thermal. This was different. The heat signature was uniformly distributed in a way I'd only seen in primates, but this was far larger than any primate known to exist in North America. The creature moved with an eerily fluid grace despite its size. It crossed the clearing in about 7 strides. I later measured the distance at 45 feet, meaning each stride was roughly 6.5 feet. I was simultaneously terrified and professionally excited, forcing myself to keep the camera steady as my heart pounded in my chest. What happened next still gives me chills. The figure stopped at the center of the clearing and turned its head directly toward my observation post. Through the thermal camera, I could clearly see the heat signature of its head moving, and I swear it was looking right at me. I was in a camouflage blind, but somehow it knew exactly where I was. The vocalization came again, but this time it was different. Lower, more guttural, and so loud I could feel it in my chest. All my equipment was running, but I was frozen in place. The creature stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two, before turning and moving back into the forest with the same fluid stride. Once it disappeared, I waited another hour before gathering the courage to step out of my blind. The snow had stopped falling about an hour before the encounter, leaving a perfect surface for tracks. What I found made my hands shake so badly I could barely operate my camera. The tracks were approximately 18 inches long, with a clear 5-toe pattern that looked disturbingly human-like, just massive. I photographed them extensively, placing my size 11 boot next to them for scale. The next 2 nights I heard the same vocalizations, but they seemed more distant, echoing through the valley. I never got another clear thermal image like that first night, though I did catch a few partial heat signatures moving through the trees at a distance. I spent hours analyzing the thermal footage when I got home. The heat signature was consistent throughout the figure, ruling out the possibility of someone in a suit. The movement pattern was smooth and natural, unlike anything that could be faked. The stride length and the temperature reading matched perfectly with what you'd expect from a large living primate. I submitted my regular wildlife photos to the magazine, but kept the thermal images and recordings to myself. Who would believe me? I've spent 14 years wondering if I should share this story. The rational part of my brain keeps trying to find alternative explanations, but I know what I saw. The thermal imaging doesn't lie. Something huge, warm-blooded, and definitely not a known species was walking through that clearing. I've gone back to that spot several times over the years, in different seasons. I've never seen anything like that again, but every time I'm in the mountains and hear an unusual sound echoing through the valleys, I wonder if it's out there, watching from the trees. The most frustrating part is that despite having thousands of dollars worth of equipment and years of professional experience, the thermal images I captured that night aren't as clear as I'd like them to be. They show the heat signature and the movement, but they don't provide the kind of definitive proof I wish I had. Still, I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know what my equipment recorded, something that, by all scientific standards, shouldn't exist in those mountains. I've kept detailed notes about everything, the exact location, though I'm hesitant to share it publicly, weather conditions, temperatures, and all the measurements I took. The technical data is irrefutable. A 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit heat signature, standing 9 feet tall, 18-inch tracks with a 6.5-foot stride length, and those distinctive vocalizations that I can still hear in my dreams. Sometimes I wonder if I should have gone public with this immediately, but I knew what would happen to my professional reputation. Now, after all these years, I'm finally sharing this because I believe people need to know what's out there. I'm not claiming to know exactly what I encountered that night, but I know it was real, and it was definitely something beyond current scientific explanation. Story 18. I need to share what happened to me and my research team back in January 2018. I've spent years trying to make sense of it, but even now, I still get chills thinking about those 2 weeks in the Minnesota wilderness. I'm a wildlife biologist, specializing in wolf behavior patterns, and I've been doing field research for over 12 years. Nothing in my experience prepared me for what we encountered. It was supposed to be a routine winter tracking study. Our team of 4, myself, Sarah, our GIS specialist, Mike, our field technician, and Dr. Chen, our lead geneticist, set up our base camp about 30 miles northwest of Duluth. The area had shown promising wolf activity in previous surveys, and we'd gotten permission from the DNR to conduct a 2-week observation period. The first weird thing we noticed was on day 3. We were checking our trail cameras when Mike spotted what looked like a makeshift shelter about 200 yards off our usual tracking route. Now, I've seen plenty of hunter blinds and temporary camps before, but this was different. The structure was massive, probably 8 feet tall at its peak, and made from thick branches that had been woven together with incredible precision. The strange part was that some of these branches were from trees that must have been at least half a mile away, based on the species. No hunter would go through that much effort. Inside the shelter, we found fish remains, mostly lake trout and northern pike. But here's the thing. The nearest fishing spot was over 2 miles away, and these fish had been eaten recently. The bones were stripped clean, but not by any animal I recognized. There were no tooth marks typical of wolves or bears. It looked more like they had been pulled apart by hand. That night, the temperature dropped to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. We were huddled in our research cabin reviewing the day's data when we heard it. It started as a single metallic bang, like someone hitting a tree with a baseball bat. Then another bang responded from about half a mile away. Then another from a different direction. This call and response went on for almost 20 minutes. Sarah wanted to go out and investigate, but something in my gut told me we needed to stay put. The next morning, we found 3 more shelters, each bigger than the last. They formed a rough triangle, about a quarter mile apart from each other. Each one contained similar remains, fish bones, partially eaten snowshoe hares, and in one, the remains of what looked like a beaver. But it was the smell that got to me. There was this overwhelming musky odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation, but more primitive somehow. I've worked with wolves my whole career, and this was nothing like that. We set up additional trail cameras around the shelters. That's when things got really strange. Every morning, we'd find at least one camera turned to face a different direction, but there were no human footprints in the snow, just these massive impressions that we initially thought were from a bear, except they showed distinct toe marks and were nearly 16 inches long. On day 8, we collected several hair samples from the shelters, dark, coarse hair that didn't match any known species in the area. Dr. Chen did preliminary DNA analysis in our field lab, and his hands were shaking when he showed me the results. The sequences weren't matching anything in our database, but they were clearly primate in origin. The breaking point came on day 10. I was reviewing footage from our thermal camera near the creek when I saw it. At 3:47 a.m., a large bipedal figure crossed the frozen creek. The thermal imaging showed it was giving off significant body heat, and based on the reference markers we'd set up, it had to be at least 7.5 feet tall. It moved with this fluid grace that was just wrong for something that size. What haunts me most is how it stopped in the middle of the creek, turned directly toward the camera, and just stood there for almost 3 minutes. The next day, we found all our remaining cameras had been systematically destroyed, not just damaged, but completely taken apart. The memory cards were missing. The metallic banging started again that night, but this time it was closer, much closer. We could feel the vibrations through the cabin walls. None of us slept. Sarah spotted it the next morning. We were packing up our equipment, all of us on edge, when she just froze mid-sentence, staring past my shoulder. About 100 yards away, partially hidden behind a thick pine, was a massive, dark figure. The size was bad enough, but it was the way it moved that turned my blood to ice. It shifted its weight in this eerily human way, but the proportions were all wrong. Its arms hung down past its knees, and its head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders, with almost no neck visible. We all saw it. We all watched as it slowly stepped behind the tree, never taking what looked like eyes, just darker spots in a face covered in hair, off us. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just the sound of our own breathing and the blood pounding in my ears. That was our last day. We called off the study early, packed up our remaining equipment and got out of there. The university department heads weren't happy, but they changed their tune when they saw the preliminary DNA results and the one thermal video we managed to save. I've been back to Minnesota many times since then, but never to that specific area. The locals I've talked to say there have been stories about that region for generations, tales of things that knock on trees and build huge shelters in the deep woods. Most laugh it off as folklore. I used to do the same. The hair samples and thermal footage are still being studied. Some say the DNA results were contaminated, that the thermal image shows a bear walking oddly through deep snow. Maybe they're right, but they weren't there. They didn't smell that primal musk, or hear those methodical knocks echoing through the frozen forest, or see those intelligent eyes watching us from an impossible face. I don't do winter field research anymore. And when I'm in the woods and hear something hitting a tree in the distance, I don't stick around to hear if anything answers back. What bothers me most now isn't just what we saw. It's the lingering feeling that it was studying us just as much as we were trying to study it. Those destroyed cameras, the careful arrangement of the shelters, the way it seemed to watch our patterns. It all suggested an intelligence that I'm still not ready to fully contemplate. Sometimes I wonder if our research site wasn't random at all. Maybe we were the ones being observed all along. I've never told this story publicly before. Honestly, I probably wouldn't be sharing it now if I hadn't seen the recent reports from other researchers in the area describing similar structures and sounds. All I know is that there's something out there in those woods that defies conventional scientific explanation. Something that's smart enough to stay hidden, strong enough to snap thick branches like twigs, and patient enough to watch and wait. The university has officially labeled our findings as inconclusive, and most of our documentation has been filed away somewhere. But I know what I saw. More importantly, I know what I felt. That deep, primal sensation that we weren't alone out there, and that whatever was watching us wasn't just some undiscovered animal. It was something that thought, planned, and maybe even tried to communicate in its own way. I still have dreams about those 2 weeks. In them, I'm always back at that frozen creek, watching the thermal footage loop over and over. But in the dreams, the figure doesn't just stand there. It walks toward the camera, getting closer and closer, until all I can see is its face filling the screen. And just before I wake up, it speaks. I don't know what's out there in the Minnesota wilderness, but I know it's watching, waiting, and far more intelligent than we're ready to admit. And sometimes, late at night, when I hear something tapping outside my window, I can't help but wonder if it's trying to tell us something. I just don't know if we want to hear what it has to say. Story 19. I've spent nearly 17 years debating whether to share this story. Even now, My hands are shaking as I type this. What I experienced during those nights in Presque Isle back in 2007 completely changed how I view the world, and not necessarily in a good way. I've been an avid hunter my whole life, spent countless nights in the Maine wilderness, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that November. For context, I'm a lifelong resident of Maine, and I've been hunting moose and deer in Aroostook County since I was old enough to hold a rifle. My father taught me everything about tracking, reading the land, and respecting nature. By 2007, I'd been hunting solo for over a decade, so when I say something was off, I mean it was really off. It was November 12, 2007. The weather that year had been unusual. We'd gotten an early snowfall in late October, but temperatures had stayed relatively mild for Maine standards, hovering around 35 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. I'd gotten a moose permit for Zone 6, and I knew of a remote spot about 12 miles northwest of Presque Isle, accessible only by a logging road that hadn't been maintained in years. The area was perfect for moose. Lots of young growth, plenty of wetlands, and far enough from civilization that pressure from other hunters was minimal. I arrived at my spot around 5:30 a.m., well before sunrise. The snow was about 4 inches deep, perfect for tracking. I parked my truck at the end of an old logging road and hiked about 2 miles in, carrying my Remington 700 in, 30.06 standard gear, and my phone, one of those early flip phones. I mainly used it as a camera and for emergencies. The moon was just past full, providing decent visibility even before dawn. The first weird thing I noticed was the silence. Anyone who spent time in the woods knows there's never true silence. There's always something moving, breathing, rustling. But that morning, it was different. No chickadees, no squirrels, nothing. The kind of silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Around 8:30 a.m., I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. In a small clearing between some paper birch and eastern hemlock, there was this perfectly circular area where the snow was completely packed down, like something had been walking in circles. And I mean perfect, about 10 feet across, with clearly defined edges. My first thought was, maybe a moose had been pawing for food, but this was different. The snow wasn't scraped away, it was compressed, like something heavy had been methodically walking in a circle. That's when I noticed the tracks around the perimeter. I've been tracking animals my whole life, and I know what bear, moose, and deer tracks look like in every condition. These were different. They were huge. I measured them with my hunting knife, which is 8 inches long, and these prints were easily twice that length. The stride length between them was massive, easily 4-5 feet. They were clearly bipedal tracks, with 5 distinct toe impressions. The snow was packed so hard in these prints that I couldn't break through it with my boot. I found something else that made my stomach turn. Strips of bark from several nearby trees had been systematically stripped off at a height of about 8 feet. Not torn off like a bear would do, but actually peeled off in long strips. There were teeth marks in the exposed wood that didn't match any animal I'm familiar with. What really got me was finding chewed bark scattered around the circle. Whatever did this was actually eating the bark, not just stripping it. I took several photos with my phone, though they didn't come out great. Phone cameras weren't what they are today. I spent most of that day observing the area from a distance, using my scope to watch for any movement. Nothing showed up during daylight hours, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. You know that sensation when someone's staring at you? Multiply that by 100. As it got dark, I made the decision that some might call stupid. I decided to stay and watch through the night. I had my truck nearby with emergency supplies, and I'd built a quick blind about 100 yards from the circular area, with good sight lines through the trees. I'm not going to lie, every instinct was telling me to get out of there, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. Around 9:45 p.m. I started hearing it. A rhythmic knocking sound, like someone hitting a hollow tree with a baseball bat, but deeper. It wasn't close, maybe a quarter-mile away, but the sound carried clearly through the cold air. I pulled out my phone and started recording. The knocking continued for about 3 minutes, then stopped abruptly. That's when I saw it. In the moonlight filtering through the trees, I caught movement, something massive moving between the trunks about 150 yards out. The movement was smooth, deliberate. Whatever it was, It was walking upright. The color was hard to make out in the darkness, but the fur appeared to be a reddish-brown, different from a bear's typical coloring. Based on the trees it passed, I estimate it was at least 8 feet tall. The creature moved into the clearing with the circular impression. What happened next still haunts me. It began walking the exact same circle where the snow was packed down, following the previous tracks perfectly. But here's the truly unnerving part. It would stop every few steps, reach up to strip bark from the trees, and eat it. The movements were so human-like, yet so alien at the same time. The way it used its hands, the deliberate nature of its actions. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct. I sat there barely breathing for what felt like hours, but was probably about 45 minutes. The whole time, I was recording with my phone, though the video quality in the dark was terrible. The audio, though, that's what really got people's attention later. When I had the audio analyzed months later by a friend who works in sound engineering, he found something bizarre. Behind the obvious sounds, the knocking, the creature's movement, my terrified breathing, there were infrasonic frequencies that shouldn't have been there. Frequencies below human hearing range, but clearly recorded by my phone. My friend said they were similar to frequencies used by large animals for long-distance communication, but the pattern was unlike anything he'd seen before. The second night was similar, though the creature appeared earlier, around 8:30 p.m. This time, it seemed aware of my presence. It never approached my blind directly, but it would occasionally stop its circuit and stand completely still, facing my direction. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The knocking sounds that night came from multiple directions, suggesting there was more than one of these things in the area. I didn't stay for a third night. Whatever I'd stumbled upon, it felt like I'd intruded on something I wasn't supposed to see. The methodical nature of the behavior, the circular pattern, the bark stripping, it all seemed ritualistic, for lack of a better word. In the years since, I've returned to that spot several times, but never alone, and never at night. The circular impression remained visible in the ground long after the snow melted, like the soil itself had been permanently compressed. The trees that had been stripped never grew new bark over those areas. I've shared this story with only a few people before now. Most react with skepticism, which I understand. Before this happened, I would have been skeptical too. But I know what I saw. I still have the audio recordings, though I've never shared them publicly. The infrasonic frequencies in particular make me uneasy. What purpose did they serve? Was it communication? And if so, with what? What troubles me most isn't the size of the creature, or its appearance, or even its behavior. It's the intelligence behind its actions. This wasn't a random animal encounter. There was purpose there, routine, methodology. Whatever I witnessed those nights, it wasn't just some undiscovered animal acting on instinct. There was consciousness behind those eyes that watched me from the darkness, intelligence in the precision of its movements. I still hunt in Maine, but never in that area, and never alone after dark anymore. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen. Some experiences change you fundamentally, alter the way you perceive the world around you. This was one of those experiences. The funny thing is, I've spent years trying to convince myself there must be some logical explanation for what I saw, but the more I analyze it, the more impossible that becomes. The tracks, the behavior, the infrasonic frequencies, it all points to something that shouldn't exist, but undeniably does. Or at least it did on those cold November nights in 2007. Story 20. I'm part of an amateur caving group, nothing too professional, just a bunch of friends who enjoy exploring the underground systems around New Mexico. There were 4 of us that day: me, Mike, who I'd known since college, Sarah, our most experienced caver, and Dave, who'd just joined our group a few months prior. We'd heard rumors about some unexplored cave systems about 15 miles outside Silver City, in an area that's pretty remote and rugged. It was March 23rd, 2013. I remember the date clearly because it was Sarah's birthday the next day, and we'd planned to celebrate after the expedition. The weather was unusually cool for that time of year, probably in the mid-50s, with this weird fog that had settled in the valleys. We'd parked our trucks about 2 miles from the cave entrance we planned to explore, mainly because the terrain was too rough for vehicles beyond that point. We started our hike around 8 a.m., carrying our usual gear: helmets, headlamps, rope, first aid supplies, water, and some basic climbing equipment. The first weird thing we noticed was how quiet it was. I mean, usually in that area you'd hear all sorts of birds, maybe some coyotes in the distance, but that morning it was just dead silent. Mike mentioned it first, and we all kind of nervously laughed it off. But looking back, that should have been our first warning. About half a mile from where we thought the cave entrance would be, Sarah stopped dead in her tracks. There, in a patch of muddy ground, was the biggest footprint I'd ever seen. I'm a size 12 shoe myself, and this thing was way bigger, had to be at least 15 inches long. It was clearly a bipedal print, but not human. The stride length between prints was massive, and they led right toward the area we were heading. Dave wanted to turn back right then. I remember him saying something felt off, but Sarah convinced us to continue. She'd been caving for 15 years and had never seen anything like this. We took some photos on our phones and measured the prints with a tape measure we had in our gear. The depth of the impressions suggested whatever made them was heavy, really heavy. As we followed the prints, the vegetation started changing. There were broken branches on some of the trees, about 7, 8 feet high, and some of the bark had been stripped off in places. The breaks didn't look like storm damage. They were too deliberate, almost like something had been marking its territory. We found the cave entrance around 10 a.m. It was larger than we expected, maybe 12 feet high and 8 feet wide. The footprints led right into it. By this point, we should have turned back, but we were too curious. We'd come prepared for caving, after all, and this was what we did. The entrance chamber was typical limestone formation, but as we moved deeper, things got strange. About 200 feet in, we found what looked like some kind of living space. There was dried vegetation arranged in what appeared to be a deliberately constructed bed or nest. It was huge, maybe 8 feet in diameter. Around it were scattered bones, mostly small animals like rabbits and what might have been deer, but they weren't scattered randomly. They were piled neatly in different areas, almost sorted by size. The smell hit us next. If you've ever been around decomposing matter, this was similar but different, more musky and intense, almost like wet dog mixed with something rotting and a weird, sweet undertone. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Sarah, who works at a veterinary clinic, said she'd never encountered anything like it. We found more evidence as we explored further. Claw marks on the walls that were way too high for any known predator in the area, more organized piles of bones, and what looked like crude tools made from rocks and branches. The deeper we went, the stronger that smell became. We'd been in the cave for about 3 hours when we heard it, a deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from somewhere deeper in the cave system. It wasn't a mountain lion or a bear, it was lower pitched and lasted longer. We all froze. Dave's headlamp beam was shaking so bad you could see his fear in the way the light danced on the cave walls. That's when we heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from one of the deeper tunnels. We killed our lights immediately, something Sarah had taught us to do in case of cave-ins, so we could preserve our vision and batteries. In the pitch black, the footsteps got closer. Whatever it was big. You could feel the vibrations through the rock floor. Then we saw it, or at least its outline, illuminated dimly by a shaft of light coming from a small hole in the cave ceiling. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. The shape was humanoid but massive, with long arms and a broad chest. It moved with purpose, not like an animal stumbling around in the dark. We stayed absolutely still, barely breathing. It moved past our position, probably about 30 feet away from us. The smell was overwhelming at this point. I remember fighting the urge to gag. It disappeared down another tunnel, and we heard those heavy footsteps gradually fade away. Mike whispered that we should leave, now. Nobody argued. We started making our way back as quietly as possible, but in our rush, Dave knocked loose some rocks. The sound echoed through the cave, and immediately we heard that deep vocalization again, but this time it was like a roar. The footsteps started coming back, faster now. We ran. I don't remember much about that exit, except the sound of our own panicked breathing and those footsteps behind us, getting closer. The smell got stronger, and right before we reached the entrance, I heard Sarah scream. I turned around for a split second, and in the beam of my headlamp, I saw something I'll never forget, a massive, hair-covered arm reaching around the corner of the cave wall. The hair was dark brown or black, matted in some places, and the hand was huge, with long fingers and dark nails or claws. We burst out of the cave into the afternoon sunlight. The sun was starting to set, and that fog from the morning had returned. We didn't stop running until we reached the trucks. When we finally caught our breath, Sarah noticed something. Her backpack had 3 long tears in it, like something had tried to grab it. Before we left, we heard that vocalization one more time. It echoed across the valley, and this time it sounded almost sad or frustrated. We saw movement at the cave entrance just for a moment, that huge silhouette standing there watching us. Then it withdrew into the darkness. We reported it to the local rangers, but they just took some notes and said they'd look into it. We went back 2 days later with a larger group, but the cave looked different. The nest area had been cleared out, the bones were gone, and that distinctive smell had faded. We found fresh footprints leading away from the cave, heading deep into the wilderness, but they disappeared after about a mile. The lab at Western New Mexico University analyzed samples we collected from the cave. Hair, some fecal matter we found, and scrapings from the claw marks. The results were inconclusive, but they did confirm that the fecal matter contained a mix of plant material and animal remains, suggesting whatever left it was omnivorous. The hair samples didn't match any known species in their database. I still can't explain what we encountered that day. I've been in those mountains my whole life, and I know what bears and mountain lions sound and smell like. This was something else entirely. Sarah doesn't go caving anymore, and Dave moved back to Colorado shortly after. Mike and I still talk about it sometimes, but we've never gone back to that specific cave. What haunts me most isn't just what we saw, it's how organized everything in that cave was. The sorted bones, the carefully constructed nest, the deliberate arrangement of everything. Whatever was living there wasn't just an animal. It was intelligent, methodical, and very, very real. I'm sharing this now because I've recently heard rumors of similar footprints being found in the area again. I've thought about going back, maybe setting up some cameras, but every time I consider it, I remember that massive silhouette in the cave entrance and that deep, resonating sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath our feet. Some mysteries, I've decided, are better left unexplored. Story 21. I'm a geologist, and what I experienced during my field research in Republic, Washington back in '97 completely changed my understanding of what's possible. I've always been a scientist first, someone who needs hard evidence before believing in anything. But what I found out there, well, I still can't explain it rationally. It was mid-September 1997, and I was doing geological surveys in the Colville National Forest, specifically focusing on rock formations that might indicate historical volcanic activity. I'd been to the area before, but this time I was working alone, planning to camp out for a week to document some promising sites I'd spotted during aerial surveys. The first 2 days were completely normal. I'd wake up at dawn, have my coffee, pack my equipment, mostly mapping tools, sample bags and my camera, and head out to document various formations. The weather was typical for that time of year, crisp mornings warming up to mild afternoons, with occasional light rain. Everything changed on the 3rd day. I'd hiked about 4 miles northeast of my base camp, following a promising ridgeline, when I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. On a rock face, partially obscured by moss, were these pictograms I'd never seen documented before. Now, I'd seen Native American rock art before, but these were different. They showed these massive humanoid figures standing next to what were clearly meant to be normal-sized humans. The scale difference was striking. The larger figures were about 3 times the size of the human figures. I spent hours photographing and sketching the pictograms, making sure to document everything precisely. That's when I noticed something odd about the surrounding area. About 50 yards from the rock face, I found these elaborate structures made from tree branches. We're not talking about random fallen branches here. These were clearly woven together, forming dome-like shapes about 8 feet tall. The branches were thick, some nearly 4 inches in diameter, and they were twisted and interlinked in ways that would have required significant strength. The really unsettling part? Some of these branches showed fresh breaks. The exposed wood wasn't weathered. This wasn't some old abandoned structure. Something had been maintaining or building these recently. That night, back at my camp, I started hearing things. I'm used to forest sounds. I've spent countless nights camping during field research, but these were different. Around 2 a.m., I was woken up by what sounded like whistling, but not like any bird I've ever heard. It was more melodic, almost human-like, but too deep and resonant. The sounds seemed to be coming from different directions, like there were multiple sources communicating with each other. I grabbed my audio recorder, I always keep one handy for field notes, and managed to capture about 20 minutes of it. The next morning, I found the first footprint. I nearly stepped in it. A massive impression in the soft soil near a small creek about 100 yards from my camp. I'm trained to measure and document everything, so I pulled out my tape measure, 17 inches long. The depth of the impression suggested whatever made it was incredibly heavy. I took photos and made a plaster cast, though my hands were shaking the whole time. Over the next 2 days, I found 4 more sets of similar prints, all heading in roughly the same direction. Near one set of prints, caught in a low branch, I found several long, coarse hairs. They were dark brown, almost black, and unlike anything I'd seen before. I carefully collected them in sample bags. The whistling continued each night, always between 1 and 3 a.m. Each time it seemed to get closer to my camp. On my second to last night, around 2:30 a.m., I heard heavy bipedal footsteps circling my campsite. The steps were slow, deliberate, and much too heavy to be human. I lay completely still in my tent, barely breathing, as whatever it was moved around out there. The smell was overwhelming, a powerful, musky odor unlike anything I'd encountered before. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Then everything went silent. The normal forest sounds, insects, nocturnal birds, even the wind in the trees, just stopped. That silence was more terrifying than any sound could have been. I felt the presence of something massive standing just outside my tent. I could hear deep, rhythmic breathing. Then came a sound I'll never forget, a low, rumbling vocalization that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. It wasn't aggressive, but it conveyed such power that I was paralyzed with fear. This standoff lasted maybe 5 minutes, though it felt like hours. Then, whatever it was, slowly moved away. I could hear the heavy footsteps gradually receding, accompanied by the sound of branches being pushed aside. The normal forest sounds slowly returned over the next hour, but I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, I found fresh prints around my campsite. They were the same size as the others, 17 inches, and formed a clear path circling my tent. There were also broken branches on several trees about 8 feet up, showing fresh breaks with exposed wood. I packed up that morning, a day earlier than planned. Before leaving, I collected as many samples as I could: hair, photographs of prints, the plaster casts, and dozens of photos of the pictograms and branch structures. I'd never been so relieved to reach my truck. Back at the university, I had the hair samples analyzed. The DNA results came back showing primate markers, but didn't match any known species. I submitted my findings through official channels, but the response was largely dismissal or uncomfortable silence. A few colleagues showed interest, but most advised me to keep quiet about it to protect my reputation. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I experienced. I've gone over my photos and samples countless times. The plaster casts and hair samples are still in storage at the university, labeled as unidentified wildlife specimens. The audio recordings, unfortunately, were mostly unintelligible due to wind noise and distance, though the deepest whistles are still faintly audible. I've never gone back to that specific site, not because I'm afraid, but because I feel like I witnessed something that wasn't meant for us to see. Those pictograms weren't just historical records, they were warnings. The local Native American tribes have stories about those woods, stories that most scientists dismiss as legends. After what I experienced, I'm not so quick to dismiss them anymore. The most frustrating part is knowing that I had real, physical evidence. DNA that didn't match any known species, footprints that couldn't belong to any known animal, and structures that required intelligence and strength beyond normal wildlife, yet being unable to prove anything definitively. Science requires extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims, and despite everything I documented, it wasn't enough to convince the scientific community. I still work as a geologist, still do field research, but never alone anymore. I've heard rumors of similar experiences from other researchers in the Pacific Northwest, but most won't talk about it openly. I understand why. Until you've experienced something like this yourself, it's easy to dismiss it as imagination or misidentification. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled. Those weren't bears or any other known animal. Those structures weren't natural formations or random debris. Sometimes I wonder if that's why these beings, whatever they are, have remained undiscovered for so long. They're intelligent enough to stay hidden, to avoid leaving definitive evidence. Maybe they've been watching us just as much as we've been looking for them. Those pictograms suggest they've been here a very long time, living alongside humans while staying just out of reach of our understanding. I don't expect anyone to believe my story, but I know what I experienced. Every time I hear about new sightings in that area, I think about those whistles in the night and that massive presence outside my tent. There's so much we don't understand about our world, and sometimes the best evidence is the kind that makes us question everything we think we know. Story 22. I've been sitting on this for months, trying to make sense of it, but I just can't keep it to myself anymore. I'm an ornithologist, and I've been studying bird nesting patterns in northern Michigan for the past decade. Nothing in my career could have prepared me for what we encountered in those woods. It was early March 2020, just before everything shut down with COVID. My team and I were conducting our annual spring migration study in the dense forests about 15 miles west of Marquette. We'd been tracking some unusual nesting activity. Several of our graduate students had reported finding massive nest-like structures way up in the mature maples and oaks, around 20 feet high. At first, we thought they might be eagle nests, but the construction was all wrong. These things were huge, maybe 8 feet across, and woven together with branches as thick as my arm. No bird in Michigan makes nests like that. We set up our observation post near a cluster of these structures. It was me, 2 grad students, Sarah and Mike, and our field technician James. We had our usual gear, night vision equipment, audio recorders, cameras, the works. The plan was to do a 72-hour continuous observation to catch whatever was building these things. The first strange thing we noticed was the complete absence of normal wildlife activity around these nests. No squirrels, no birds, nothing. In all my years studying forest ecology, I'd never seen anything like it. It was as if everything was actively avoiding that section of the forest. Around 2 a.m. on our second night, the temperature dropped to about 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and this thick fog rolled in. I was on watch while the others slept in our blind. The forest was dead silent, not even wind in the trees. Then I started getting this feeling. You know that sensation when you absolutely know you're being watched? It was like that, but 100 times stronger. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my hands started shaking so bad I could barely hold my binoculars. That's when we first heard it. This deep, resonant sound that started like a low hum and built into something between a howl and speech. It wasn't a wolf or a bear. I know those sounds. This was different. It had structure, patterns, like someone speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Our audio equipment picked it up clear as day, and when we analyzed it later, we found distinct phonetic patterns that matched no known animal vocalizations. I woke up the team. We all sat there, barely breathing, as more of these sounds echoed through the trees. They were coming from different directions, like there were multiple sources communicating with each other. The closest one couldn't have been more than 100 yards away. James was manning the thermal camera when he suddenly grabbed my arm. His hand was ice cold, and he was pointing to the display without saying a word. On the screen, I could see this massive heat signature moving between the trees. It was bipedal, walking upright, and it was huge. Based on the scale markers in our equipment, it had to be at least 8 feet tall. The figure moved with purpose, stopping at various trees and seemingly collecting branches. Its movements were deliberate, almost human-like, but the size and strength it displayed were anything but. We watched it snap off branches as thick as baseball bats like they were twigs. The creature was working its way toward one of the nest structures. As it got closer to our position, this overwhelming musky odor hit us, like wet fur mixed with rotting vegetation, but there was something else to it, something I can't quite describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Through the thermal scope, we could make out more details. The proportions were all wrong for a bear: long arms, massive shoulders, and a clearly defined head that sat directly on those shoulders, no real neck to speak of. The entire body was covered in what appeared to be thick hair or fur. That's when Mike's phone accidentally went off. He'd forgotten to silence it. The sound echoed through the quiet forest like a gunshot. Everything stopped. The vocalizations ceased immediately. Through the thermal, we could see the figure freeze, then slowly turn its head toward our blind. I've never felt terror like that moment. We could hear heavy footsteps moving toward us, slow and deliberate. The smell got stronger. Sarah was quietly crying. James was frantically trying to pack up our most expensive equipment. I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring at the thermal display as this massive heat signature moved closer and closer. It stopped about 50 feet from our position. Even through the fog and darkness, we could make out its silhouette now with our own eyes. The size of it. It was like looking at a person, but all the proportions were wrong. Those eyes, I know it saw us. I know it knew exactly where we were and what we were doing. For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, it just stood there watching us. Then it made this sound, not like the earlier vocalizations, but something lower, almost like a warning. The branch it was holding, easily 4 inches thick, was snapped in half like a pencil. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it turned and moved away with shocking speed for something so large. We could hear it crashing through the undergrowth, getting further away. None of us moved for at least an hour after that. When the sun finally came up, we packed our gear with shaking hands and got out of there. But we didn't leave empty-handed. Our audio equipment had captured everything. The vocalizations, when analyzed, showed complex patterns consistent with language, not just random animal sounds, but structured communication with distinct phonetic elements. We found fresh prints in the mud near our blind, 16 inches long with 5 distinct toe impressions. The stride length was over 6 feet, and in the nest we'd been observing, we found fresh branches added to the structure, along with several dark, coarse hairs caught in the bark. I still have those recordings and samples, but I don't know what to do with them. The university administration strongly suggested we focus on our normal research targets. They made it clear that pursuing this further could impact our funding. But I know what we saw. I know what we recorded. Those nests weren't made by any known animal. And those vocalizations, they still haunt my dreams. I've spent my entire career studying animals in these forests, but that night showed me there's something else out there, something that challenges everything we think we know about North American wildlife. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I needed to share this. Maybe someone else has seen something similar. Maybe someone else has heard those sounds. The weirdest part? When we went back a week later to collect more samples, every single nest was gone, not fallen down or destroyed, completely gone, with no trace they were ever there. Even the broken branches on the ground had vanished. If we didn't have our recordings and samples, I might have convinced myself it was all some kind of shared hallucination. I still do research in those woods, but never at night anymore. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick, I swear I can hear those vocalizations in the distance. And every time I find a broken branch that's too thick for any normal animal to snap, I wonder, are they still out there, watching us study them while they study us? Story 23. It started in late August 2004. The wheat was nearly ready for harvest, standing tall and golden across my 800 acres. I'd been farming that land for 23 years at that point, and I knew every inch of it. The first sign that something was off came when I was checking the irrigation system near the back field, about a quarter mile from the silos. I noticed a wide path through the wheat, not like deer or elk tracks, which I'm plenty familiar with. This was different. The wheat was pressed down in a way I'd never seen before, creating a path about 3 feet wide. At first I figured maybe some kids had been messing around, but we're pretty isolated out here. Our nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and people don't just wander through wheat fields for fun. I followed the path for about 50 yards before I found the footprints. I'm not easily rattled, but seeing those prints made my blood run cold. They were huge. I measured them with my tape measure, 16 inches long. The impressions were deep too, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Being a farmer, I know what bear tracks look like. These weren't bear tracks. They were footprints. Human-like footprints, but massive. I took photos with my old digital camera, even though the quality wasn't great. I still have them somewhere, but they don't really do justice to what I saw. The prints were so clear you could see the toe impressions. 5 toes, just like a human foot, but proportionally larger. That night, I heard it for the first time. I was in the house watching TV around 10:30 p.m. when this sound started. At first, I thought it was something wrong with one of the grain silos, kind of a rhythmic metallic banging. But it wasn't mechanical. It had this irregular pattern to it, almost like someone was deliberately making the noise. Then came the vocalization. I've heard every animal sound you can imagine out here: coyotes, mountain lions, bears, elk. But this was different. It was this deep, rumbling sound that seemed to come from something with massive lungs. The closest I can compare it to is maybe a bull elk's bugle, but much deeper and more powerful. It made the windows vibrate. I installed security cameras after that first night. Nothing fancy, just 4 basic cameras covering the silos and the equipment yard. For the next few weeks, things kept escalating. The wheat paths started appearing more frequently, always at night. I'd find them in the morning, cutting through different sections of the field. Sometimes they'd lead to the silos, sometimes they'd just create these strange patterns through the wheat. On September 12th, around 2 a.m., one of the cameras caught something. I still remember sitting at my kitchen table the next morning, coffee getting cold, while I rewound the footage over and over. This large, dark figure moved between the silos. The camera's infrared made everything black and white, but you could clearly see this thing was huge. I estimated about 8.5 feet tall based on the silo height. It moved smoothly, almost gracefully for something so big. Not like a person in a costume stumbling around. The really unsettling part was how it seemed to know where the cameras were. It would stay just at the edge of their range or keep the silos between itself and the cameras. But one time, it looked directly at the camera. I'll never forget that. Even in the grainy footage, you could see its eyes reflect the infrared light. They were set in this massive head that seemed to sit directly on its shoulders, no real neck to speak of. The sounds continued every few nights. Sometimes it was the banging on the silos, other times just those deep vocalizations. I started keeping a journal of every incident, noting the time, type of sound, and duration. The pattern seemed random, but there was definitely intelligence behind it. It wasn't just an animal making noise, it felt like it was trying to communicate something. One night in late September, about 2 weeks before harvest was due to start, I had my closest encounter. I was walking back from checking on the irrigation pump, something I'd done thousands of times before. The sun had just set, but there was still enough light to see. That's when I smelled it. Everyone talks about the smell, and they're right. It's like nothing else. This powerful, musky odor mixed with something that reminded me of wet dog and rotting vegetation. The smell hit me just as I heard movement in the wheat to my left. The stalks were swaying, but there was no wind. Whatever was moving through there was big enough to part the fully grown wheat like it was nothing. Then everything went quiet. The crickets stopped chirping. The birds went silent. Even the distant highway noise seemed muted. I stood there, completely frozen. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. That's when it stood up. The wheat in that field was almost 4 feet tall, and this thing rose up from it like a mountain. In the dim light, I could make out its massive frame, covered in dark, matted hair. It was about 30 yards away, just standing there, watching me. I'd love to say I did something brave or clever, but I didn't. I turned and ran faster than I've ever run in my life. Behind me, I heard this deep huffing sound, followed by movement through the wheat. But it wasn't chasing me. It was moving away, parallel to my direction. By the time I reached the house, my heart was about to explode. The next day, I found more prints in that area. They were perfect impressions in the soft soil near the irrigation pipe. I took more pictures and even tried to make a cast using some quick, dry concrete I had in the shed, but it didn't turn out great. I measured everything meticulously: stride length, foot size, depth of impression. The stride was over 6 feet long. Whatever this thing was, it could cover ground incredibly fast. For the next 2 weeks, the encounters continued, but changed in nature. It seemed more curious than threatening. I'd find prints circling my tractors or equipment. The security cameras would catch glimpses of it examining the silos, sometimes reaching out to touch them with these massive human-like hands. The banging sounds became more regular, almost like it was trying to establish a pattern. I debated calling the police or wildlife services, but what would I say? That Bigfoot was playing percussion on my grain silos. I knew how that would sound. Instead, I started researching. Turns out there had been similar reports in the area going back decades. Nothing recent, but in the 70s and 80s, several ranchers reported similar experiences. Large footprints, strange sounds, equipment being examined by something large and powerful. The activity peaked just before harvest was set to begin. The night before my crew was supposed to arrive, I recorded the clearest vocalization yet. It was a series of deep calls, almost like whale sounds, but more guttural. They lasted for almost an hour. The next morning I found one last set of prints leading away from the farm, heading toward the Missouri River breaks. After that night, everything stopped. No more sounds, no more prints, no more wheat paths. The harvest went normally, and my crew never saw anything unusual. I've got hours of security footage, dozens of photos and pages of notes, but the creature never returned. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, but then I look at those pictures or watch those videos, and I know what I saw was real. I still farm that land, but I never go out after dark anymore if I can help it. Every harvest season, I find myself watching the wheat fields a little more carefully, listening for those distinctive sounds. Part of me hopes it'll come back, just so I can prove to myself I'm not crazy. The other part hopes it stays away. Some things in this world aren't meant to be understood, I guess. A few people in town know about what happened. Most think I'm nuts, but there are a couple of old-timers who've pulled me aside to share similar stories. They've seen things too, out in the breaks or up in the hills. Nobody talks about it much, but we all know something's out there. Something that's managed to stay hidden despite all our technology and development. I've thought about sharing this story before, but it never felt right until now. I'm not looking to convince anyone or start any debates. I just know what I experienced, and I know it wasn't a bear, wasn't a person in a costume, and wasn't my imagination. Whatever that creature was, it was intelligent, curious, and powerful beyond anything I'd ever encountered. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wheat is high and the wind is still, I swear I can still hear those deep rumbling calls echoing across the fields.